A generation ship sounds like humanity's greatest adventure. It isn't. It's humanity's greatest experiment, and the test subjects never agreed to participate. Nobody who boards a generation ship will ever see the destination, neither will their children. Imagine 10,000 people sealed inside a metal world for 1,000 years. What does that actually do to a human being? If you want to genuinely understand your place in the cosmos, make sure to give this video a like. Now let's get started. A generation ship, sometimes called a multi-generational ship, a world ship, or an interstellar ark, is a theoretical spacecraft designed to travel to another star system over a span of time so vast that the original crew will never live to see the destination. The men and women who strap in at departure will die in transit. Their children will die in transit. Their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, their great-great-grandchildren, all of them will be born, will live full lives, and will be buried in the belly of the ship, never having set foot on any world at all. The people who finally arrive, if they arrive, will be separated from the founders by perhaps 30 or 40 generations of unbroken birth, life and death inside a sealed metal environment. Think about what that means for a moment. 30 to 40 generations. That's roughly the same number of generations that separate you from the year 1000 AD, from the early medieval world, from a time before the printing press, before the Renaissance, before any of the political or philosophical foundations that shape how you think about yourself and your society even existed. The founders of the mission would be as remote to the arrivals as Viking Age and Norsemen are to you right now, and we expect those arrivals to still remember why they're there. Let's talk about the physical environment first, because it establishes everything else. Earth is extraordinarily generous. It provides sunlight, atmospheric oxygen, liquid water, nutrient-rich soil, and a web of interconnected biological systems that took 3.5 billion years to evolve. We don't manage any of that. We just live inside it, taking it completely for granted, breathing air that algae and trees produce, drinking water that mountain snowpacks and ocean evaporation cycle through the atmosphere for free. A generation ship has none of that infrastructure. Every molecule aboard is finite. The carbon in your body, the nitrogen in your muscle tissue, the phosphorus in your DNA. When you die, that material doesn't disappear. It stays on the ship. It has to. Because there is no resupply mission. There is no emergency delivery of fresh supplies from Earth. By the time a distress signal could even reach home, traveling at the fastest speed physics allows, and a response could be sent back, centuries might have passed. Help is not coming. This is why scientists who study closed ecological life support systems, and NASA has funded this research seriously since the 1980s, describe the challenge as one of the hardest engineering problems humans have ever attempted. You are not just building a vehicle, you are building an entire planet, compressed into a structure small enough to move through space, designed to run indefinitely without any external input whatsoever. The closest humanity has come to actually testing this was the Biosphere 2 project in Oracle, Arizona, which ran from 1991 to 1993. 8 scientists sealed themselves inside a 3-hectare enclosed structure, the largest closed ecosystem ever built, to test whether a self-sustaining biosphere could support human life. The results were sobering. Within months, oxygen levels inside began dropping to dangerous levels, eventually falling so low that the team experienced symptoms of altitude sickness and cognitive impairment. The team had to pump in external oxygen just to function. Populations of pollinating insects collapsed unexpectedly, threatening the food crops. Morning glories took over and began strangling other plant species. Cockroach populations exploded. Crazy ants, an invasive species, spread throughout the structure and proved almost impossible to control. Soil bacteria consumed far more oxygen than anyone had modeled. And Biosphere 2 had sunlight streaming in through its glass panels. It had Earth's gravity. It had a team of scientists right outside the glass, ready to intervene. It had every possible advantage a generation ship would not have. Now imagine maintaining that balance, that impossibly delicate balance of atmospheric chemistry, nutrient cycling, water reclamation, crop yield, biological diversity and ecosystem stability in a sealed vessel in the dark between the stars for 1,000 years, not with 8 people, with tens of thousands, not for 2 years, for 40 generations. The engineering problem is almost beyond comprehension. But here's the deeper truth, the one that keeps researchers in this field genuinely troubled when they think about it honestly. The machines are actually the easy part. Machines can be repaired. Systems can be redesigned. If something breaks, you can, in theory, fix it, rebuild it, reroute around it. Human ingenuity has always found ways to solve physical problems given enough time and resources. What you cannot so easily repair is the human psyche. Psychologists who study extreme isolation and confinement, researchers embedded with Antarctic winter-over teams, naval submarine crews, and the rotating crew of the International Space Station have identified a pattern so consistent across different environments that it has its own name, the third quarter phenomenon. Discovered through decades of behavioral research, it describes what happens around 3/4 of the way through a long, isolated mission. Morale drops sharply, interpersonal conflict spikes, motivation collapses, depression becomes nearly universal. People who were performing well begin to struggle. Cooperation breaks down even among highly trained, carefully selected professionals who volunteered for the mission and know exactly when it ends. Now, consider what that psychological trajectory looks like when the mission never ends. When there is no 3/4 mark, because you were born on the ship, and you will die on the ship, and your children will die on the ship. When the question of how long until we get there has no answer that any living person on board will ever personally experience. Researchers who've studied the likely psychological profile of generation ship populations describe something that has no real historical parallel, a society of people who are, in an almost literal sense, trapped, not by any individual decision, not by any crime or misfortune, but simply by the circumstances of their birth. They did not choose this. Their parents chose it for them. Their grandparents chose it for them. And the founders, the people who made the original decision, are dust and recycled organic matter in the ship's biological systems. What does it feel like to grow up knowing that? To live your entire life inside a few kilometers of corridors and cultivation bays with artificial lighting calibrated to simulate a sun you've never actually seen. No open sky, no weather, no horizon, no wilderness, no ocean, no mountain. Nothing that evolution spent millions of years wiring your nervous system to need and respond to, and all of it, every single day, for your entire life. Studies on urban populations, on prisoners in long-term confinement, on children raised in sensory-impoverished environments, all of them point toward the same basic finding. The human brain requires a degree of environmental richness, novelty, and natural stimulation that a sealed spacecraft simply cannot reliably provide. The consequences of long-term deprivation range from elevated anxiety and clinical depression all the way to measurable changes in cognitive function, social behavior, and emotional regulation. Now layer that across 40 generations, the psychological inheritance of a people who have never known anything else. And if you want to feel just how staggering the numbers actually get when you start trying to cross interstellar space, check out the video on the card above, where we explore what would really happen if you traveled 1 light year. That video connects directly to everything we're talking about here. It'll genuinely make the scale of this hit differently. The link is in the description and pinned on the comments. But here's where the story takes a turn that almost nobody sees coming. We've talked about ecology, we've talked about psychology, but we haven't touched the variable that scientists argue might actually be the most dangerous of all, the one that operates silently, invisibly, across every single generation, accumulating damage that no instrument can detect until it's too late to correct. The genetics of a small, isolated population over 1,000 years tell a story that is both scientifically precise and deeply unsettling. And when you understand what genetic drift, the founder effect, and inbreeding depression actually do to a closed population over that timescale, the number 10,000 stops feeling like an overestimate. It starts feeling almost reckless. Let's start with a number that should genuinely unsettle you: 25. That's the minimum number of close relatives, first cousins, siblings, parent-offspring pairs, that a population can tolerate reproducing with each other before the compounding genetic consequences become statistically irreversible within just a few generations. 25 pairings. That's it. Cross that threshold consistently, and the mathematics of heredity begin working against you in ways that no medical intervention available today can fully correct. Now think about a generation ship. Even with 10,000 people aboard, you are still dealing with what geneticists call a closed gene pool. No new genetic material is coming in, ever. Every person born on that ship is drawing from the same original deck of cards, the DNA contributed by the founding population at departure. And with every passing generation, through a process called genetic drift, rare gene variants get randomly lost from the population, while others, including harmful recessive mutations, quietly increase in frequency simply by chance. This isn't a hypothetical concern. This is observable, measurable biology. We can see it in island populations, in endangered species, in historically isolated human communities. The Amish population of North America, which descends from a founding group of roughly 200 individuals in the 1700s, has significantly elevated rates of several rare genetic disorders, not because those founders were unhealthy, but simply because small founding populations inevitably carry a limited range of genetic variation, and random chance determines which variants get passed forward and which disappear. This is called the founder effect, and it is as mathematically inevitable as gravity. On a generation ship, the founder effect doesn't disappear just because your starting population is larger. It slows, but over 1,000 years, over 30 to 40 generations of reproduction inside a closed system, it compounds, quietly, relentlessly, like interest accumulating on a debt that nobody is watching. A 2018 study in the journal Scientific Reports, led by researcher Cameron Smith at Portland State University, modeled exactly this scenario. Smith ran population genetic simulations across multi-generational interstellar voyages and found that to maintain what he called secure levels of genetic diversity, meaning enough variation to keep the population adaptable, resilient, and free of catastrophic inbreeding depression, a founding population of at minimum 10,000 people was necessary. But his models also revealed something that his paper describes with careful scientific restraint. Even at 10,000 unexpected mortality events, a disease outbreak, a catastrophic system failure, a violent social collapse, could reduce the population to a level where genetic recovery becomes extraordinarily difficult. Depending on the severity and the timing of the event within the voyage, recovery might not be possible at all. And here's the detail that most people completely miss when they read studies like this. It's not just about the total number of people. It's about who reproduces, when they reproduce, how many children they have, and whether those reproductive patterns stay distributed across the full genetic diversity of the population for every single generation across the entire 1,000-year voyage. Because here's what actually happens in real human societies, in every culture ever studied. Reproduction is never random. Never. People choose partners based on proximity, on shared culture, on family connections, on social status, on religious community, on language, on 100 different invisible social forces that naturally push people toward partners who are already genetically similar to them. That tendency, called assortative mating, is one of the most robust findings in the entire history of social science. In a society of 10,000 people living inside a sealed vessel for 1,000 years, those social clusters will inevitably form. They always form. And as the generations pass, those clusters will become increasingly genetically distinct from one another, even while remaining physically confined within the same structure. You won't have one human population after 1,000 years. You will have something closer to a collection of sub-tribes, small, inward-looking reproductive communities that share a ship but increasingly do not share a gene pool. The genetic consequences of that fragmentation, running across 40 generations of compounding drift, are difficult to model precisely, but every serious researcher who has attempted it arrives at the same general conclusion: without active, sustained, institution-level management of the population's reproductive patterns, genetic diversity will decline to dangerous levels within a few centuries. And that word, management, opens a door that leads somewhere deeply uncomfortable, because if the mission requires that reproduction be managed across 1,000 years to preserve genetic health, what exactly does that management look like? Who decides it? Who enforces it? What happens to the person who falls in love with someone from a genetically overrepresented family line and is told that their relationship, however meaningful and real, is a threat to the survival of everyone aboard? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions that bioethicists, sociologists, and mission planners who work on generation ship feasibility have been genuinely wrestling with for years. And the answers, or rather, the absence of clean, comfortable answers, represent what many researchers consider to be a more fundamental obstacle than any engineering problem the mission will face. A 2020 paper in the journal Space Policy, authored by bioethicist Konrad Sochik and colleagues, examined the ethical frameworks that would be required to govern a multi-generational interstellar mission. The paper's conclusions were stark. Any governance structure with enough authority to actually manage the biological and social requirements of the voyage would, by any reasonable standard applied today, qualify as deeply authoritarian. The ship cannot function as a pure democracy if a democratic majority votes to do something that destroys the genetic or ecological foundations of the mission. The mission's survival requirements would have to override individual preference in ways that no free society on Earth currently tolerates. This creates what Sochik calls a fundamental ethical paradox at the heart of the entire concept. A generation ship capable of succeeding might require a social structure that most of the people boarding it would never voluntarily accept. And remember, the people being governed by this structure after the first generation never chose it at all. They were born into it. Every child born on that ship is, in a sense that is philosophically very precise, a conscript. They have been enrolled in a 1,000-year mission without their consent, without any possibility of withdrawal, and without any alternative reality available to them. Their entire existence, every breath they take, every relationship they form, every choice they make, occurs within a framework built by people who died before they were born in service of a destination they will never personally reach. Some philosophers who have engaged seriously with this question, including the Oxford ethicist and space policy researcher Charles Cockell, argue that this represents one of the most profound moral dilemmas in the entire history of human civilization. Others push back and say that every generation is in some sense born into circumstances they did not choose, that none of us consented to the world we inherited, and that the generation ship simply makes that universal truth more visible. But there is a difference, as some researchers point out, between being born into an imperfect society that you can leave, change, or resist, and being born inside a sealed vessel with no exit, no alternative, and no appeal to any authority beyond the ship's own governance structure. The generation ship removes the escape valve that makes inherited circumstances bearable. And when you take that away from a human population, when you close every door and seal every exit for 1,000 years, history is very clear about what tends to happen next. Every stable human society in recorded history has maintained its stability through some combination of four mechanisms: the ability to trade with outsiders, the ability to migrate away from conflict, the ability to appeal to an external authority, and the ability to reform internal power structures through revolution or institutional change. Take away trading partners, and economic stagnation follows. Take away migration, and social pressure builds without release. Take away external authority, and internal power becomes absolute. Take away the possibility of meaningful reform, and the only mechanism left for structural change is violent upheaval. A generation ship removes all four simultaneously. You cannot trade with outsiders. There are none. You cannot migrate away. There is nowhere to go. You cannot appeal to Earth. By the time your signal arrives and a response returns, everyone involved in the original dispute will be dead, and reform becomes extraordinarily dangerous in a system where stability is not just a social preference, but a physical survival requirement. If a revolution destabilizes the food production systems, or the atmospheric processors, or the water reclamation infrastructure, people don't just experience hardship, they die. And if enough of them die at the wrong moment in the voyage, the entire genetic and demographic foundation of the mission collapses with them. This is why political scientists who have studied the generation ship problem, and it is a legitimate academic field, tend to reach conclusions that sound almost paradoxical. The governance structure most likely to get the mission to its destination successfully is probably not the governance structure that the people aboard would consider humane or just. The most stable structure is probably the most rigid one, and the most rigid structure is probably the one most likely to generate the resentment, resistance, and eventual violent collapse that destroys the mission anyway. There may be no clean solution to this. And that truth, that the generation ship may be fundamentally irreconcilable with human political psychology, sits at the center of the entire concept like a wound that won't close. But here's what makes this even more extraordinary, and why this question matters far beyond the theoretical. Because we are not, at this point in history, simply daydreaming about generation ships as a science fiction exercise. The James Webb Space Telescope, launched on December 25, 2021, and delivering data that has been described by astrophysicists as genuinely revolutionary, has now given us the ability to characterize the atmospheres of exoplanets in ways that were impossible just a decade ago. We know, with a degree of certainty that grows with every new observation, that planetary systems are not rare, they are the norm. Virtually every star we study closely enough shows evidence of planets. Many of those planets orbit within what astronomers call the habitable zone, the range of distances from a star where liquid water could exist on a surface. The nearest star system to our own, Alpha Centauri, is approximately 4.2 light-years away, at the fastest speed any human-made object has ever traveled in history. Reaching it would take somewhere in the range of 17,000 years. For a generation ship moving at a more realistically achievable fraction of the speed of light, perhaps 1 or 2%, which itself represents an engineering challenge far beyond anything currently feasible. The voyage would take between 200 and 400 years at minimum. A 1,000-year voyage implies a destination further still, perhaps Tau Ceti, approximately 11.9 light-years away, perhaps Epsilon Eridani, 10.5 light-years out. Both systems have been studied extensively, and both are considered among the more plausible long-range targets for future human exploration. These are real places, real stars with real planets that real telescopes have studied in real detail. The generation ship is not a fantasy. It is a contingency plan that a growing number of serious scientists and institutions believe humanity may one day be forced to execute, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. Which means the questions we're asking right now about genetics, about psychology, about governance, about what it actually means to trap 40 generations of human beings inside a metal shell for 1,000 years, are not academic exercises. They are the questions that will determine whether that mission is something we survive. And we haven't even gotten to the radiation yet, because the space between the stars is not empty. It is threaded with something that moves silently through metal walls, through flesh, through DNA itself, and it does its damage so slowly, so quietly, that you might not notice what it's taking from you until it's already gone. There is a moment, sometime in the late 1980s, when NASA engineers working on long-duration spaceflight began to realize that the thing most likely to kill astronauts on a deep space mission wasn't a meteor strike, wasn't a system failure, wasn't running out of food or oxygen or water. It was nothing, or rather, it was something that looked and felt like nothing, something you couldn't see, couldn't smell, couldn't taste, couldn't hear. Something that passed through the hull of your spacecraft, the way light passes through glass, and then kept going straight through your body without so much as a whisper of sensation to tell you it had been there. Cosmic radiation. And the more carefully researchers studied it, the more uncomfortable the numbers became. Let's establish what we're actually talking about, because most people have a mental image of radiation that comes entirely from nuclear power plants and medical imaging, sources that are controlled, localized, and temporary. What fills the space between star systems is fundamentally different in both its origin and its character. The universe is a particle accelerator of almost incomprehensible scale. Supernovae, the catastrophic deaths of massive stars, release energy equivalent to what our sun will radiate across its entire 10 billion-year lifespan, all compressed into a matter of seconds. That energy accelerates charged particles, protons, helium nuclei, the stripped cores of heavier atoms to velocities approaching the speed of light itself. These particles then travel across the galaxy for millions of years, bouncing through magnetic fields, accumulating into a diffuse but constant rain of high-energy radiation that permeates the entire interstellar medium. They are called galactic cosmic rays. And they are genuinely extraordinary objects, not because of how many there are, which is actually relatively few compared to other forms of radiation, but because of how much energy each individual particle carries. A single high-energy galactic cosmic ray can carry more energy than a professionally thrown baseball, packed into a single subatomic particle moving at a fraction below the speed of light. When that particle hits a nucleus inside one of your cells, the interaction is not subtle. It can shatter DNA strands, create cascading secondary radiation as it smashes through surrounding material, and deposit damage across a trail of biological tissue in ways that your body's natural repair mechanisms were simply never designed to handle. On Earth's surface, you are protected from this by two overlapping shields that you have never had to think about for a single second of your life. The first is the planet's magnetic field, the magnetosphere, which deflects the majority of charged particles before they ever reach the upper atmosphere. The second is the atmosphere itself, a column of air roughly 10,000 kilometers thick above your head that absorbs and scatters the remainder. By the time cosmic radiation reaches sea level, it has been reduced to a tiny fraction of its original intensity. You receive a dose, it's measurable, but it's manageable. Your biology has evolved alongside it for millions of years. Step outside those two shields, and everything changes. Astronauts aboard the International Space Station, which orbits at roughly 400 kilometers altitude, still within the outer edge of Earth's magnetic field, receive radiation doses approximately 10 times higher than people on the surface. Over a 6-month mission, a station crew member absorbs a dose roughly equivalent to what a radiologist receives over 5 years of working with medical imaging equipment. NASA tracks these doses carefully and enforces career exposure limits. The total amount of radiation an astronaut is permitted to accumulate across their entire working life, because the long-term cancer risk is real, measurable, and taken extremely seriously, now move beyond Earth's magnetic field entirely, out into deep space, on the trajectory a generation ship would travel, and the exposure climbs sharply again. NASA's data from the Curiosity rover's transit to Mars, using the Radiation Assessment Detector instrument, measured the radiation environment during the roughly 250-day journey. The numbers were sobering. A round trip to Mars, including time on the surface, would expose an astronaut to roughly 1.01 sievert of radiation, a unit of biological radiation dose. NASA's current career limit for astronauts is set at a level designed to keep lifetime cancer risk increase below 3%. A single Mars round trip consumes a substantial portion of that lifetime allowance. Mars is 8 light minutes away from the Sun at its closest approach. The destination of a generation ship is measured in light years. The exposure timescales are not months, they are centuries. A 2014 paper published in Science Translational Medicine by researchers at the University of California, Irvine, exposed mice to iron ions, one of the most damaging components of galactic cosmic radiation, and one that is essentially impossible to shield against with conventional materials, and measured the neurological effects. The results were alarming in ways that went beyond cancer risk, which had been the primary concern until that point. The irradiated mice showed significant impairments in cognitive function. They performed measurably worse on tests of spatial navigation, learning, and memory. They showed heightened anxiety responses. Examination of their brain tissue revealed structural changes, including damage to the prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain most associated with complex decision-making, social behavior, and impulse control, that persisted long after the initial exposure. The researchers described the findings as a serious concern for long-duration deep space missions, noting that the cognitive effects appeared at dose levels that astronauts on an interstellar voyage would accumulate within years, not decades. Think about what that means in the context of a generation ship. You are not just talking about elevated cancer rates, a risk that plays out over decades and can to some degree be monitored and managed medically. You are talking about a population whose cognitive function, whose neurological health, whose capacity for complex reasoning and emotional regulation is being quietly degraded by the radiation environment of deep space across every year of the voyage. The people responsible for maintaining the ship's systems, for making governance decisions, for solving the unexpected crises that will inevitably arise across 1,000 years. They will be doing all of that inside brains that are being continuously irradiated by particles traveling at near-light velocity. And the children born on the ship will begin accumulating that neurological damage from the moment of their birth. Some researchers have raised the possibility that a fetus developing in a high radiation environment could sustain damage to the developing nervous system during the most critical windows of neural formation. Windows where the effects of radiation exposure are substantially more severe than in adult tissue. This is not speculation. The sensitivity of developing fetal tissue to ionizing radiation is one of the most thoroughly documented findings in radiobiology. It is why pregnant women are not supposed to receive non-essential medical imaging. In the radiation environment of interstellar space, every pregnancy for 1,000 years would occur inside a radiation field orders of magnitude more intense than anything a hospital radiology department would ever permit. So, what do you do about it? How do you shield a population of 10,000 people from a radiation environment that passes through metal walls as though they weren't there? The honest answer, and researchers say this with a candor that is somewhat unusual in a field often characterized by optimism, is that we don't fully know yet. And the solutions that do exist all come with costs so severe that they create new problems nearly as serious as the ones they solve. The most straightforward shielding approach uses mass. Dense material, lead, polyethylene, water absorbs and scatters incoming radiation before it reaches human tissue. Water is actually among the most effective practical shielding materials for certain types of radiation, and proposals for generation ships sometimes incorporate the idea of surrounding the crew habitation areas with a thick shell of water tanks that would serve double duty as radiation shielding and long-term water storage. But the physics of shielding against galactic cosmic rays specifically creates a cruel paradox. High-energy particles, particularly the heavy nuclei that carry the most biological damage, don't simply stop when they hit a dense shield. They interact with the shield material and produce secondary radiation, a spray of lighter particles created by the collision that can actually deliver significant doses to tissue on the other side. This phenomenon, called secondary particle production, means that beyond a certain thickness of shielding, adding more material can paradoxically increase certain components of the radiation dose rather than decreasing it. You hit a point of diminishing returns that no amount of additional mass can overcome. The only shielding approach that could genuinely protect against the most energetic galactic cosmic rays without this secondary particle problem would be a magnetic field strong enough to deflect incoming charged particles before they reach the hull, essentially recreating Earth's magnetosphere around the ship. The concept is real. It's called an active magnetic shielding system, and it has been studied seriously by both NASA and the European Space Agency. But the engineering requirements are staggering, generating a magnetic field strong enough to deflect the highest energy particles and maintaining it reliably for 1,000 years without failure would require superconducting magnets operating at cryogenic temperatures, sustained by power systems whose reliability across 10 centuries has never been demonstrated in any context anywhere. And if that magnetic shielding system fails, even briefly, even partially, the population inside is suddenly exposed to the full force of the interstellar radiation environment with no warning and no backup. There's another source of radiation that makes the galactic cosmic ray problem look almost manageable by comparison, and it comes not from the depths of the galaxy but from the ship's own destination star, from whatever sun is waiting at the end of the voyage. Stars are not steady, reliable beacons of gentle warmth. They are dynamic, volatile plasma environments that periodically release events of extraordinary violence. Solar flares, eruptions of radiation and charged particles from the stellar surface can release energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons in a matter of minutes. The largest such events, called coronal mass ejections, hurl billions of tons of magnetized plasma into space at speeds of several million kilometers per hour, Earth's magnetosphere and atmosphere protect us from these. A generation ship in open space has no such protection during transit, and during the approach to its destination star, as the ship enters the new solar system and begins decelerating toward the target planet, the crew will spend years within increasingly close range of a star they have never studied, whose activity cycle they have observed only from a distance measured in light years, and whose behavior across the critical period of arrival they cannot predict with certainty. A major stellar particle event during that approach phase, at the precise moment when the crew needs to be at peak cognitive and physical capacity to execute the most demanding phase of the entire mission, could incapacitate or kill a significant fraction of the population. The timing of stellar activity doesn't negotiate. Now, here's the dimension of this that tends to hit people the hardest when they really sit with it. Everything we've discussed in this part of the video, the cognitive damage from ion radiation, the elevated cancer rates, the developmental risks to fetuses, the catastrophic potential of a shielding failure, all of it accumulates silently, invisibly. A person being irradiated by galactic cosmic rays doesn't feel it happening. There's no pain, no immediate sensation, no moment of awareness where you can register that something important is being taken from you. The damage is written in your DNA, in your neural architecture, in your cellular repair systems, in the language of molecular biology that your conscious mind has no access to. Across a 1,000-year voyage, you have a population of human beings quietly sustaining biological damage that their medical technology, however sophisticated, can treat symptomatically, but probably cannot prevent at the fundamental level. You cannot prescribe a medication that stops a relativistic iron nucleus from shattering a DNA strand inside a neuron in your prefrontal cortex. You can repair some of the damage afterward if you catch it early enough. You can screen for cancers, treat them, manage them, but you cannot stop the exposure. You cannot step outside it. You cannot take a break from it. It is simply the price of moving through interstellar space in a biological body. And some researchers, particularly those working at the intersection of astrobiology and long-duration spaceflight medicine, have begun to ask a question that feels almost too uncomfortable to say out loud. Is the biological human body the right vehicle for a journey of this length and this nature at all? That question leads somewhere extraordinary, and it opens one of the most genuinely fascinating debates happening in serious scientific circles right now. A debate about what the people aboard a generation ship might look like, biologically, by the time they arrive, not just because of what radiation does to a genome across 40 generations of exposure, but because of what the mission itself might require us to deliberately change. Because the generation ship isn't just a vessel that carries human beings through space, it is, whether its designers intend it or not, an evolutionary pressure. And evolution, the blind, patient, mathematical process that shaped every living thing that has ever existed on Earth, does not stop operating just because the environment has changed from a biosphere to a spacecraft. Over 1,000 years, over 40 generations. It will be working on everyone aboard. What it produces at the other end is something that nobody, not even the most optimistic mission planner, can predict with confidence. If you are enjoying this video, make sure to subscribe and give a thumbs up. Every video, we go deep into the science that makes the universe feel personal. Here's a thought that almost nobody considers when they imagine a generation ship arriving at its destination. The people who step off that vessel, the ones who finally open the hatch after 1,000 years of darkness and recycled air and artificial light, will not be human beings in quite the same sense as the people who boarded it. Not because of some dramatic mutation, not because of science fiction-style genetic engineering gone wrong, but because of something far more subtle, far more ancient, and far more inevitable than any of that. Evolution doesn't care about your mission objectives. It doesn't read the founding documents. It doesn't honor the original vision of the people who designed the ship. It operates through one mechanism and one mechanism only: differential reproductive success. The individuals whose traits, in any given environment, produce more surviving offspring gradually see those traits become more common in the population. The individuals whose traits produce fewer surviving offspring see theirs fade, generation by generation, quietly. Mathematically, without intention or awareness, the population drifts toward whatever the environment selects for, and the interior of a generation ship is an environment unlike any that has shaped a human population in the entire 300,000-year history of our species. Let's start with the physical, because the body keeps score, and 1,000 years of living in an artificial environment will leave marks that go all the way down to the skeletal level. Gravity, or rather, the simulation of it, is one of the central engineering challenges of any long-duration space habitat. In genuine microgravity, the human body begins deteriorating almost immediately. Bone density drops at a rate of roughly 1 to 2% per month in the load-bearing skeleton. Muscle mass, particularly in the legs and lower back, atrophies rapidly because it is no longer needed to support body weight against gravitational pull. The cardiovascular system, which on Earth works constantly against gravity to pump blood upward from the lower body to the brain, begins to reorganize itself for a fluid environment, causing facial puffiness, nasal congestion, and eventually measurable changes in the shape of the brain itself as cerebrospinal fluid redistributes toward the head. NASA's Twin Study, a landmark research project that followed astronaut Scott Kelly through his year-long mission aboard the International Space Station while his identical twin brother Mark remained on Earth as a control subject, documented changes across nearly every biological system measured. Gene expression patterns shifted. Telomere length, the protective caps on chromosomes that shorten with cellular aging and stress, changed in unexpected ways. Cognitive performance on certain tests declined. The microbiome changed substantially. Some of these changes reversed after Scott returned to Earth. Others did not fully recover even after months of rehabilitation. That was 1 year. In one person, with Earth's gravity and biology waiting to help him recover the moment he landed. Now run that experiment for 1,000 years across 40 generations with no recovery period and no return to Earth ever. Most serious generation ship designs address this by incorporating rotation. Spin a large enough structure at the right angular velocity, and the centrifugal force experienced by people on the inner surface of the rotating section mimics the effect of gravity. This concept, first mathematically formalized by rocket pioneer Konstantin Tsiolkovsky in the early 20th century and later popularized by physicist Gerard O'Neill in the 1970s, is the foundation of virtually every credible generation ship architecture proposed by serious researchers. The physics works, we understand it well. A cylindrical habitat rotating at the right speed can produce something functionally indistinguishable from Earth-level gravitational acceleration for the people living on its inner surface. But functionally indistinguishable hides some important complications. The Coriolis effect, a consequence of living in a rotating reference frame, means that moving objects, including the fluid in your inner ear and the blood in your circulatory system, experience subtle deflecting forces that don't exist in a true gravitational field. On a habitat large enough, several kilometers in diameter, these effects are small enough that the human body adapts without significant difficulty. On a smaller habitat, they can cause persistent disorientation, nausea, and balance disturbances that some individuals never fully adapt to. But here is the deeper biological question that rotation-based artificial gravity raises when you think across generational timescales. Will children born and raised in a rotating habitat develop differently from children raised in genuine gravity? Their vestibular systems, the intricate fluid-filled structures in the inner ear that give your brain its sense of orientation, balance, and spatial position, will calibrate to a rotational environment from the moment of birth. Their proprioceptive systems, the network of sensors in muscles, tendons, and joints that tell your nervous system where your body is in space, will develop in response to Coriolis forces that simply don't exist on a planetary surface. By the time these children grow up and their own children are born, the baseline of what their nervous systems consider normal will have shifted in ways that researchers cannot yet fully predict. After 10 generations of this, after the nervous system has been calibrating to a rotating environment for 10 successive developmental cycles, the cumulative drift in sensory processing, in spatial cognition, in the deep neurological architecture that underlies balance and movement could be substantial. Whether people shaped by that developmental history could simply walk out onto a planetary surface and function normally is genuinely unknown. The vestibular adaptation required might be significant. It might be manageable with training and time, or it might represent a fundamental mismatch between the body they've developed and the gravitational environment they're supposed to be inheriting. Now add the radiation dimension we explored, and the picture becomes even more complex. Galactic cosmic rays don't just damage DNA randomly. They interact preferentially with rapidly dividing cells, the cells that are most actively copying their genetic material, because that's when DNA is most vulnerable to strand breaks. The cells that divide most rapidly in the human body include immune system cells, gut lining cells, and, critically, the reproductive cells that carry the genetic information forward to the next generation. This means that across a 1,000-year voyage, every generation is being conceived by parents whose reproductive cells have been exposed to continuous cosmic radiation throughout their entire lives. The mutation rate in those cells, the frequency at which errors are introduced into the genetic code being passed forward, will be elevated above the baseline that human biology evolved with on Earth's surface. Most of those mutations will be neutral or harmful. A very small fraction might be beneficial in the ship's environment. And here's where it gets genuinely interesting from an evolutionary biology perspective, because the ship's environment is not random. It has specific, consistent selection pressures that differ meaningfully from any environment in which human beings have ever previously evolved. Resistance to radiation damage, the ability to repair DNA strand breaks more efficiently, to clear damaged cells more effectively, to maintain cognitive function under elevated radiation exposure, will be under positive selection pressure for the entire voyage. Individuals who carry genetic variants that make them slightly more radiation resistant will, on average, live longer, remain cognitively sharper, and potentially leave more descendants than individuals who don't. Over 40 generations, even a very small selective advantage can shift the genetic composition of a population measurably. Tolerance for confined spaces, for low sensory novelty, for the psychological conditions of permanent enclosure, traits that today we might associate with introversion, with a lower need for environmental stimulation, with high tolerance for routine and predictability, may confer a subtle but real survival and reproductive advantage in a generation ship environment. People who find confinement psychologically devastating, who require open space and natural environments, and the stimulation of a complex, unpredictable world to maintain their mental health, will, on average, struggle more. Their well-being and potentially their reproductive success may suffer accordingly. Over 40 generations, a population that began as a representative cross-section of humanity might drift, through purely natural selection, toward a psychological profile that is better suited to permanent enclosure than any human population that has ever existed. Whether that population would be better or worse at colonizing a new world, at the open environment, high novelty, high uncertainty task of building a civilization from scratch on an alien planet is a genuinely open question. There's another dimension of biological change that researchers discuss with particular intensity, and it operates not through DNA sequence changes, but through something more subtle and more rapidly acting: epigenetics. Epigenetic changes are modifications to gene expression that don't alter the underlying DNA sequence but do change which genes are turned on and which are turned off in any given cell or tissue. Unlike DNA mutations, which accumulate slowly across generations, epigenetic changes can occur within a single lifetime in response to environmental conditions, and critically, some of those changes are heritable. They can be passed from parent to child through mechanisms that are still being actively researched and are not yet fully understood. The study of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance is one of the most exciting and contested frontiers in modern biology. Research on human populations that survived historical famines, particularly the Dutch hunger winter of 1944 to 1945, and the effects of famine in 19th century Sweden studied through detailed parish records, has shown that nutritional stress experienced by grandparents can have measurable effects on the metabolic health of grandchildren through epigenetic mechanisms that skip across generations without any change in DNA sequence. In the radiation environment of a generation ship, with its particular nutritional constraints, its psychological stressors, its specific patterns of sleep and activity and social interaction, epigenetic patterns will be shaped by those conditions throughout every individual's lifetime, and some fraction of those patterns will be transmitted forward. The biological inheritance that each generation passes to the next will include not just their DNA sequence, but a layer of epigenetic information reflecting everything their bodies experienced in response to the ship's environment. After 40 generations of this, 40 cycles of environmentally shaped epigenetic inheritance, each one building on the last, the biological profile of the population could differ from the founding generation in ways that might never be fully reversed, even after arrival on a new world with completely different environmental conditions. And this brings us to the question that sits at the absolute center of the generation ship concept. A question that seems purely philosophical at first, but turns out to have deeply practical consequences. What is the mission actually for? The obvious answer is to carry humanity to another star system and establish a civilization there, to ensure that human life continues even if something catastrophic happens to Earth, to extend the reach of our species across the galaxy and secure our long-term survival. But here's the tension that emerges when you think carefully about biology and generational change. The people who arrive after 1,000 years are not the same people who departed. They are descended from them. They carry some of their genes filtered through 40 generations of selection, mutation, epigenetic modification, and random drift. They grew up inside an environment that shaped their bodies, their nervous systems, their psychological profiles, and their social instincts in ways that no human being in history has ever been shaped before. Are they the continuation of the founding population? Or are they something new? And if they are something new, if the voyage itself has made them, biologically and psychologically, into a genuinely novel kind of human being, then whose vision are they carrying forward? Whose civilization are they extending? What exactly is being preserved? The philosopher and bioethicist Susan Schneider has argued that a mission long enough to span multiple generations isn't really transporting a civilization to another star. It is creating one. The ship is not a vehicle, it is a world, and the people it produces over 1,000 years are not travelers who eventually arrive somewhere. They are inhabitants of the only world they have ever known, who happen to be aboard a vessel that is moving. The arrival event, the moment the ship enters a new solar system and begins its approach to the target planet, is not a homecoming for these people. It is first contact with an alien sky, with genuine weather for the first time in 1,000 years, with an uncontrolled biological environment filled with organisms, chemistry, and physical conditions that their bodies, shaped by artificial gravity, artificial light, closed ecological systems, and 1,000 years of evolutionary drift, have never encountered and were never designed to handle. The immune systems of the arriving population will be particularly concerning. Immune function in human beings is calibrated throughout life by exposure to the microbial environment, the enormous variety of bacteria, viruses, fungi, and other microorganisms that your immune system encounters, responds to, and learns from continuously. A closed spacecraft environment, however large, cannot replicate the microbial diversity of a planetary surface. The microbiome of the ship's population, the community of microorganisms living in and on every human body, which researchers increasingly recognize as a critical component of immune function, metabolic health, and even neurological well-being, will drift away from its Earth baseline over 1,000 years, shaped by the limited microbial ecology of the ship's closed environment. Step onto a new world with a microbiome shaped by 1,000 years of artificial enclosure, and encounter a planetary surface teeming with alien biological chemistry, and the immunological consequences are impossible to predict from where we stand today. They could be mild, they could be catastrophic. We genuinely don't know. This is not a small detail. It could determine whether the entire mission succeeds or fails in its final moments, not because of any failure of engineering or governance or genetics, but because of the invisible biological world that every living thing carries within itself. And yet, and this is the part that I find most genuinely moving when I think about it, human beings have always done this. In a very real sense, we have always been generation ship passengers. Every person alive today is the product of an unbroken chain of ancestors stretching back 300,000 years through every kind of hardship, every kind of environmental pressure, every kind of crisis and catastrophe and near extinction that our species has survived. Our ancestors crossed land bridges to reach new continents. They sailed open oceans in vessels that had no more certainty of survival than a generation ship. They carried their genetic material, their culture, their knowledge, their stories, across distances and timescales that felt to them every bit as vast and terrifying as interstellar space. They didn't know what was on the other side. They didn't know if they would survive the crossing. They went anyway. The generation ship is, in a sense, simply the next chapter of a story that started the moment the first human being looked at the horizon and wondered what was beyond it. We are made of stardust, literally, chemically, factually, and the impulse to move toward the stars is written into us as deeply as anything else that defines our species. But wonder and impulse alone have never been enough. The crossing has always required something more, something harder, something that the romanticized image of the generation ship tends to leave out entirely. It has always required a civilization capable of maintaining itself under pressure, of passing its essential knowledge forward across generations without corruption or loss, of keeping faith with a destination that no living member of the community has ever seen and may never fully believe in. And that, the question of cultural and institutional survival across 1,000 years, is where the story gets darkest of all, Because we have examples, here on Earth, of institutions that were designed to last centuries and didn't, of knowledge systems that were painstakingly assembled over generations and then lost in a single catastrophic event, of languages that died when the last fluent speaker died, of technologies that were forgotten and had to be rediscovered, of civilizations that collapsed under pressures far less extreme than those a generation ship will face, the Library of Alexandria, the Roman Empire, the Norse settlements in Greenland, which maintained a functioning civilization for nearly 500 years before disappearing entirely. Their fate still not fully understood, their records fragmentary and silent about what finally brought them down. 500 years, half the length of a generation ship voyage, and that was a civilization with open access to the sea, with trading partners, with the ability to leave. How do you keep a civilization intact for twice that long, inside a sealed vessel, with no outside contact, no external reference points, no ability to trade knowledge or culture with anyone beyond the ship's own walls? Here is something that happened in the 1960s that almost nobody outside of aerospace engineering knows about, and it is one of the most quietly terrifying stories in the entire history of human technology. When NASA began developing the Saturn V rocket, the most powerful launch vehicle ever successfully flown, the machine that carried human beings to the moon, the engineering knowledge required to build it existed across thousands of documents, thousands of individual specialists, hundreds of contractors, and an organizational structure of almost incomprehensible complexity. The program worked. It put 12 human beings on the surface of the moon across 6 successful landings between 1969 and 1972. It was, by any measure, one of the greatest engineering achievements in the history of our species, and then it was cancelled. The program wound down. The teams dispersed, the specialists retired, moved on, died. The documents were archived, some of them properly, some of them not. Some were lost entirely, some survived but without the contextual knowledge required to interpret them correctly. And when, decades later, engineers at NASA and private aerospace companies attempted to reconstruct the Saturn V's engines, particularly the F1 engine, the most powerful single-chamber, liquid-fueled rocket engine ever built, they discovered something that should have been impossible. They could not fully reproduce what their predecessors had built, not because the documents were entirely gone, but because the tacit knowledge, the unwritten understanding of why certain decisions were made, what the engineers had learned through years of hands-on experimentation, the accumulated intuition that only comes from actually building and testing and failing and rebuilding, that knowledge had not survived. It lived in people, and the people were gone. Engineers describe this process, the recovery of lost technical knowledge from incomplete documentation, as reverse engineering our own past. And even with all the advantages of modern computational modeling, advanced manufacturing, and a budget that the original program never had, reproducing the F1 engine took years of painstaking work, and the result was not quite identical to the original. That happened in less than 50 years, with written records, with living institutional memory just barely within reach, with the full resources of the most technologically advanced nation on Earth. Now imagine what happens to the technical knowledge required to operate a generation ship across 1,000 years of isolation, with no external reference, no internet, no ability to call a specialist who isn't already aboard, and 40 successive generations of human beings who may or may not consider the preservation of that knowledge to be their personal responsibility. The academic study of how knowledge survives or fails to survive across generations is called cultural transmission theory, and it sits at the intersection of anthropology, cognitive science, evolutionary biology, and history. Researchers in this field have spent decades studying how different types of information propagate through human populations, how they change as they pass from person to person and generation to generation, and under what conditions they are preserved faithfully versus degraded, distorted, or lost entirely. The findings are not reassuring for anyone planning a multi-generational mission. Human memory is not a recording device. It is a reconstructive process. Every time you recall something, you are not playing back a stored file, but rebuilding it from fragments, filling gaps with inference and assumption, shaping it unconsciously to fit your current understanding and expectations. Across multiple transmissions, across one person teaching another, who teaches another, who teaches another, this reconstructive quality means that information drifts, details change, reasoning gets replaced by rules of thumb, context disappears, leaving only the surface behavior without the understanding that originally motivated it. Psychologist Frederick Bartlett demonstrated this with elegant simplicity in the 1930s through a series of experiments in which he had subjects read a short story and then retell it from memory, with each retelling then becoming the source for the next subject's version. Across successive retellings, the story changed dramatically, not randomly, but in a consistent direction. Unfamiliar cultural details were replaced by familiar ones, complex causal structures were simplified, information that didn't fit the reteller's existing mental frameworks was quietly dropped or reinterpreted. Within just a handful of transmission steps, the original story was essentially unrecognizable. Now apply that to a maintenance manual for an atmospheric processor, to the operational protocols for a nuclear reactor, to the medical knowledge required to diagnose and treat the diseases that will emerge in a closed biological environment across centuries, to the foundational principles of genetics that someone will need to understand in order to manage the population's reproductive health across 40 generations. Written records help. Obviously they do. The invention of writing is precisely what allowed human knowledge to accumulate across generations in a way that oral tradition alone cannot reliably achieve. A well-maintained digital library with redundant backup systems can in principle preserve text indefinitely, but text alone is not knowledge. Text is a representation of knowledge, and interpreting that representation correctly requires a reader who shares enough context with the writer to understand not just the words, but the framework within which those words were chosen. Consider the challenge of reading a technical document written 1,000 years ago, not in terms of linguistic translation, though that alone is substantial, but in terms of conceptual translation. The assumptions embedded in that document, the things the author considered too obvious to explain, the specialized vocabulary that meant something precise to a reader in that era and something subtly different today. All of these create barriers to accurate interpretation that simple literacy cannot overcome. A generation ships technical documentation written by the founding generation and then maintained across 40 successive generations of people whose educational background, cultural context, and intellectual framework will drift incrementally away from the founders, will face exactly this interpretive challenge, not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, generation by generation. The gap between what the documents say and what the current generation understands them to mean will widen. And in a system where misunderstanding a technical document doesn't mean a failed exam, but potentially a catastrophic system failure, that interpretive drift is a survival-level threat. History gives us one particularly sobering case study in civilizational knowledge loss that researchers who study generation ships return to repeatedly: the Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BC, over the span of roughly 50 years, virtually every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously failed. The Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Canaanites, the Cypriots, all of them experienced catastrophic disruption. Cities were burned, trade networks collapsed, populations declined sharply, and the sophisticated administrative and technological knowledge that had sustained these civilizations, including the ability to produce bronze itself, which required complex international trade networks for tin and copper, largely disappeared. What followed, in Greece specifically, was what historians call the Greek Dark Ages, a period of roughly 300 years during which literacy itself was lost. The Linear B script, which the Mycenaeans had used for administrative record-keeping, vanished completely. When Greek civilization re-emerged and developed a new writing system, the alphabet adapted from Phoenician script. It was working from a nearly blank slate. The accumulated knowledge of the Bronze Age palace economies had to be rebuilt essentially from scratch, 300 years of darkness, from a collapse that took 50 years to unfold. In an interconnected world with neighbors, trade partners, refugee populations carrying fragments of knowledge across borders, a generation ship has none of those safety mechanisms. If knowledge begins to slip, if the institutional structures that maintain and transmit critical technical understanding start to fail, there is no neighboring civilization to carry the fragments forward. There is no trade partner who happens to have preserved the relevant documentation. There is only the ship and the people inside it, and whatever they can reconstruct from what remains. The specific vulnerability that concerns researchers most is not the dramatic, visible knowledge loss, the kind that would be obvious enough to trigger emergency preservation efforts. It is the quiet, invisible kind, the gradual erosion of understanding that leaves the surface intact while hollowing out the substance beneath. Imagine a community of engineers 300 years into the voyage. They maintain the ship's systems competently. They follow the protocols established by their predecessors faithfully. They understand in operational terms what to do in the scenarios their training covers. But the deeper theoretical understanding, the physics and chemistry and biology that would allow them to reason from first principles when something genuinely novel happens, has gradually faded over those 300 years of transmission. The training has drifted from understanding to procedure, from reasoning to ritual. This is not a hypothetical failure mode. It is a pattern that appears repeatedly in the history of technical knowledge within institutions that have been operating long enough for their original founding expertise to become remote. Organizations follow procedures whose original rationale nobody alive can articulate. Safety protocols are maintained because they have always been maintained, not because anyone currently working there fully understands what they are protecting against. The knowledge lives in the written record and in the habit. The understanding that made it possible to create those records and develop those habits in the first place is gone. In a stable environment, this kind of procedural drift is manageable, potentially for very long periods, as long as nothing truly novel demands a response that the inherited procedures don't cover. But novel situations across 1,000 years are not optional. They are guaranteed. Equipment fails in ways that the original designers didn't anticipate and the maintenance manuals don't address. Biological problems emerge that require original medical thinking, not just protocol execution. Social crises develop that demand governance innovation rather than inherited rule following. The ability to respond effectively to genuine novelty requires exactly the deep theoretical understanding that procedural drift erodes. And there's a subtler dimension of this that goes beyond technical knowledge into something even more fundamental. The mission itself, the purpose of the voyage, the identity of the people aboard as part of a project larger than any individual life, has to survive transmission across 40 generations to remain motivationally viable. Because without a shared understanding of why the ship exists and where it is going and why that destination matters, the social contract that holds the community together has no foundation. This is not a small thing. Shared purpose is one of the most powerful forces in human social organization. Communities with a strong collective identity and a meaningful shared goal demonstrate extraordinary resilience under pressure. They maintain cooperation, they accept sacrifice, they sustain effort across very long timescales in ways that communities without that shared purpose simply cannot. But shared purpose is not self-sustaining. It has to be cultivated, transmitted, reinforced, made emotionally real for each successive generation, not just recited as a formula, but genuinely felt as a living commitment. And that cultivation requires institutions, schools, rituals, stories, ceremonies, art, music, philosophy, that are themselves capable of surviving transmission across centuries without losing their power to move people. The challenge is that the further from the founding generation any given cohort of children is born, the more abstract and distant the mission's rationale becomes. The founders left Earth. They remembered it. They felt the loss of it as a real embodied emotional experience. Their children grew up hearing stories from people who had actually seen an open sky, who had felt rain, who had stood on ground that extended to the horizon and beyond. Those stories carried an emotional weight, a vividness of lived detail that made the destination feel real and the sacrifice meaningful. By the 10th generation, the founders are myth. By the 20th, they are ancient history. By the 30th, they are as remote as the people who built Stonehenge are to you right now. Figures from a world so different from the present that even the most faithful historical record struggles to make them feel genuinely human. And the destination, the planet waiting at the end of the voyage, has never been seen by anyone alive. It exists only in documents and images and stories. It is, to the people born in the middle centuries of the voyage, purely theoretical, an article of faith rather than a known reality. What does it take to keep an entire society motivated, organized, and functionally intact in service of a destination that nobody alive has ever experienced and that none of the currently living will ever reach, sustained across centuries of darkness and confinement and sacrifice? Researcher and anthropologist Cameron Smith, whose population genetics work we discussed earlier, has written about this challenge explicitly. He argues that the generation ship will require something that functions in sociological terms very much like a religion, a system of shared belief, ritual, story, and institutional authority capable of transmitting meaning and purpose across generations with enough fidelity and emotional power to sustain the community through the inevitable periods of crisis, doubt, and despair. He is careful to note that this doesn't necessarily mean a supernatural religion in the traditional sense. It could be a secular ideology, a scientific worldview, a philosophical framework, any system capable of providing the same functions that religious institutions have historically provided in human communities: shared identity, moral framework, ritual reinforcement of collective values, and a narrative that makes individual suffering meaningful within a larger story. But whatever form it takes, it needs to be robust enough to survive the same transmission challenges that threaten technical knowledge, and it needs to do so while remaining genuinely motivating to people whose lived reality is increasingly remote from the world that created it. That is an extraordinarily difficult needle to thread, because the same institutional rigidity that preserves a belief system across centuries tends to make it brittle, resistant to the adaptation that changing circumstances demand. And a belief system that cannot adapt will eventually collide with reality in ways that shatter it. When that collision happens, when the ideology that has sustained the community's sense of purpose and identity for generations suddenly fails to explain or accommodate something that the community is actually experiencing, the social consequences can be catastrophic. There is a name for the kind of crisis that emerges when a community's foundational belief system catastrophically fails to explain its reality. Sociologists call it an anomy event, a collapse of the shared normative framework that gives social behavior its meaning and direction. The term was developed by French sociologist Émile Durkheim in the late 19th century, and it describes a condition characterized by social disorientation, loss of purpose, sharp increases in antisocial behavior, and a collapse of the institutional structures that normally regulate community life. Durkheim studied anomy primarily through the lens of suicide rates in populations undergoing rapid social change, and found a striking correlation between normative collapse and self-destructive behavior. In a generation ship context, an anomy event triggered by the failure of the mission's sustaining ideology could manifest as something far more dangerous than elevated individual distress. It could represent an existential threat to the entire mission, a population-level crisis of meaning and purpose occurring inside a sealed environment with no exit and no outside help, at a moment when the ship's systems require constant, competent, motivated maintenance to keep everyone alive. The timing of such a crisis within the voyage matters enormously. In the early centuries, the founding generation's direct emotional connection to Earth and to the mission's rationale provides a buffer. People can be reminded, by living witnesses, of what was left behind and why. In the final approach to the destination, the proximity of arrival provides a different kind of motivational anchor. The end is in sight, the purpose is being fulfilled, the sacrifice is about to be vindicated. It is the middle centuries, the long, featureless dark in between, that researchers identify as the period of maximum vulnerability. Centuries when the origin is too remote to feel real and the destination is too distant to feel imminent, when the community exists in a kind of permanent present tense, sustained by nothing except the inherited framework of a purpose that was chosen by people who have been dead for generations, and that will be fulfilled, if it is fulfilled, by people who haven't been born yet. What does a society do with itself in that void? The honest answer, based on everything we know about human psychology and social organization under conditions of prolonged confinement and meaninglessness, is that it fractures. Not necessarily violently, though violence is always a possibility, but into the informal social structures that human beings have always built when formal institutions fail to meet their needs. Into subcultures, factions, cults, cliques, ideological communities organized around alternative sources of meaning. Some of those informal structures might be genuinely adaptive, creative, innovative, capable of solving problems that the formal institutions have stopped being able to address. Others might be corrosive, parasitic on the ship's resources, organized around beliefs or behaviors that are incompatible with mission survival. And in a sealed environment where the physical infrastructure of survival is inseparable from the social infrastructure of cooperation, the distinction between a manageable cultural diversity and a catastrophic social fragmentation is not always clear until it's too late to repair. This is the point in the analysis where many researchers who have spent serious time on the generation ship problem arrive at a conclusion that feels deeply counterintuitive, but is, upon reflection, almost unavoidable. The biggest threat to a multi-generational interstellar mission is not the engineering, it is not the radiation, it is not the genetics, it is not the psychology of individual confinement. It is time itself, not time as a resource that runs out, but time as a force that works on everything, that erodes institutions, that transforms living memory into legend and legend into myth, that that turns urgent, personally felt purpose into abstract inherited obligation, that slowly, invisibly, across generations of transmission, changes the thing being transmitted until it no longer resembles what it started as. Every civilization in human history has had to contend with the eroding force of time. None of them has had to do it in complete isolation, without any of the cross-cultural exchange, the external stimulus, the competitive pressure, or the environmental variety that has historically driven civilizational renewal. The generation ship puts human civilization in a box and asks it to stay intact for 1,000 years. And the box is moving away from everything that has ever helped human civilization repair itself. And yet, there may be a way through. Not a perfect solution, not a guarantee, but a genuine possibility grounded in real science that some researchers believe could change the fundamental calculus of multi-generational interstellar travel in ways that make the prospect not just survivable, but genuinely extraordinary. It involves the most advanced biology happening in laboratories right now. It involves a rethinking of what a generation ship actually means at its deepest level. And it raises questions about identity, consciousness, and what it means to be human that are among the most profound that science has ever been forced to seriously engage with. There is a laboratory at the University of Colorado Boulder where researchers have been doing something that sounds, on the surface, almost mundane, studying the biology of a small aquatic animal called the tardigrade. You've probably seen images of them. They look vaguely like 8-legged microscopic bears, barely half a millimeter long, and they live in moss and soil, and the thin film of water on plant surfaces all over the world. They are, by almost any biological measure, absurdly unremarkable creatures, except for one thing. When the environment around a tardigrade becomes hostile, when it dries out, when temperatures drop toward absolute zero, when radiation levels climb to doses that would kill any other known animal within minutes, the tardigrade does something that has no real parallel anywhere else in the animal kingdom. It draws its legs inward, expels almost all the water from its body, replaces it with a sugar called trehalose that essentially turns its cellular machinery into glass, and enters a state called cryptobiosis. Its metabolism drops to less than 1/10,000th of its normal rate. Its heartbeat stops. Its brain activity flatlines by any measure we can apply. It becomes, by the most reasonable biological definition available, something extremely close to dead, and then, when conditions improve, sometimes decades later, sometimes after exposure to radiation doses hundreds of times higher than what would kill a human being, it simply wakes up, rehydrates, walks away, reproduces, lives a full life as though nothing happened. Tardigrades in cryptobiosis have survived exposure to the vacuum of space. They have survived gamma radiation at doses of 57,000 grays. For context, 6 grays is lethal to a human being. Specimens retrieved from a dried museum sample collected in 1848 were successfully rehydrated and revived more than a century later. Now, why does this matter for a generation ship? Because if you could achieve something functionally analogous to cryptobiosis in human beings, a state of dramatically reduced metabolism, suspended biological aging, and protected cellular function that could be maintained for years or decades at a time, you would solve, in a single stroke, the majority of the most serious problems we have discussed across the last 5 parts of this video. The concept is called suspended animation, and it is not science fiction. Not anymore. It sits at the intersection of several rapidly advancing fields: cryobiology, metabolic medicine, anesthesiology, and molecular biology, and the distance between where the science is today and where it would need to be to enable genuine human hibernation has been narrowing at a pace that researchers in the field describe as genuinely surprising even to themselves. Let's be precise about what currently exists. because the gap between current capability and the popular imagination of being frozen in a pod for 100 years is still substantial, but perhaps not as wide as you'd expect. Therapeutic hypothermia is already routine clinical medicine. Cooling patients to temperatures between 32 and 34 degrees Celsius, just a few degrees below normal body temperature, dramatically slows cellular metabolism, reduces the brain's oxygen demand, and provides a protective window during cardiac surgery, stroke treatment, and traumatic brain injury care that has saved thousands of lives. Patients are routinely maintained in this state for days at a time and recover fully. The technique works because slowing metabolism slows every biological process that would otherwise cause damage during a period of reduced blood flow or oxygen supply. Going deeper, cooling a body to temperatures where metabolism drops by 90% or more is a different challenge entirely. At very low temperatures, water inside cells forms ice crystals that shred cellular membranes and destroy tissue irreversibly. This is the fundamental barrier that cryobiology has been working against for decades. Some organisms overcome it through a variety of biological strategies. Freeze-tolerant frogs in North America, for example, allow their bodies to partially freeze each winter and survive through the production of glucose as a cryoprotectant that limits ice crystal formation. Tardigrades use trehalose. The biological toolkit for surviving extreme cold exists in nature. It just doesn't exist in mammals, at least not yet. A 2020 study published in Nature demonstrated that researchers had successfully induced a hibernation-like state in mice, animals that do not naturally hibernate, by activating a specific set of neurons in the hypothalamus using ultrasound. The mice's body temperature dropped dramatically, their metabolism slowed to a fraction of normal, and they entered a torpor state that was maintained for extended periods without apparent harm. When the stimulus was removed, they recovered normally. Mice are not humans. The hypothalamus of a mouse is not the hypothalamus of a person. But the fundamental neural circuitry that controls metabolic state and body temperature is deeply conserved across mammalian evolution, meaning the same basic biological machinery exists in human brains. The question is whether it can be accessed and controlled with sufficient precision to produce a safe, reversible torpor in a human being. NASA has been funding research into this question seriously since at least 2013 through its innovative Advanced Concepts program. A proposal by aerospace engineer Mark Schaffer, developed with biomedical researchers, outlined a concept for long-duration hibernation in astronauts during transit to Mars, not indefinite suspension, but 30-day torpor cycles, repeated across the 6-month journey, with the crew rotating through active and hibernating phases to maintain ship operations with minimal personnel while drastically reducing resource consumption. The proposal estimated that a hibernating crew would require 69% less food, produce dramatically less carbon dioxide, and need substantially less living space than an active crew, potentially allowing a spacecraft to be designed around a fraction of the resources a conventional mission would require. Scale that concept up to a generation ship, and the implications are transformative. If a population of 10,000 people could be maintained in medically induced torpor for the vast majority of the voyage, with small rotating crews of a few hundred cycling through active duty periods to maintain the ship's systems, you have fundamentally changed the nature of the mission. The psychological problem of confinement across 1,000 years becomes manageable if most of the journey is spent unconscious. The resource requirements of maintaining 10,000 active human metabolisms for a millennium collapse to a fraction of their original scale. The radiation exposure accumulates during active periods only, reducing the lifetime biological dose enormously. The genetic drift problem is partially addressed by dramatically compressing the effective number of generations. If people are aging at 1/10 the normal rate during hibernation, a 1,000-year voyage might represent only a handful of biological generations rather than 40. It doesn't solve everything. The rotating active crew still ages, still works, still faces every psychological and social challenge of living in a sealed environment. The hibernating population still requires constant medical monitoring, temperature regulation, and protection from the physical consequences of prolonged inactivity, muscle atrophy, bone loss, cardiovascular deconditioning, and the medical technology required to bring tens of thousands of people in and out of hibernation repeatedly across 1,000 years with near zero failure tolerance doesn't exist yet and will require breakthroughs in several fields simultaneously. But the direction is clear, the biology is real, and the gap is closing. If suspended animation represents a partial solution, one that addresses some of the most serious challenges without fundamentally changing the nature of the mission, there is a more radical proposal that goes much further, and that sits at the edge of what many researchers consider ethically thinkable. It is called the embryo ship concept, and it replaces the question of how to keep 10,000 living, breathing, aging human beings alive across 1,000 years with a completely different question: what if you didn't? The idea, explored seriously in academic literature by researchers including physicist and futurist Cameron Smith and ethicist Anna Smajdik, is this: instead of carrying a large population of adult human beings in a conventional crew, you carry a much smaller crew, perhaps as few as a few dozen people, along with a vast biorepository of frozen human embryos, genetic material, and the technological systems required to gestate, birth, and raise children artificially at the destination. The embryos don't age, they don't consume resources, they don't develop psychological problems from confinement, they don't experience the radiation environment of interstellar space. They don't form factions or forget technical knowledge or lose faith in the mission's purpose. They are, in the most literal biological sense, passengers who place absolutely no demands on the ship's life support systems for the duration of the voyage. Upon arrival, after the destination planet has been assessed, after a minimal initial infrastructure has been established, the embryos would be gestated using artificial womb technology, a field called ectogenesis, and the resulting children raised by the arriving crew and by care systems designed for the purpose. The genetic diversity problem dissolves. A biorepository of frozen embryos can carry the genetic information of hundreds of thousands of individuals in a physical volume that would fit inside a single room. The psychological problem of multi-generational confinement disappears entirely. The people who arrive are the same people who left, or their immediate successors, rather than the descendants of 40 successive generations of isolated confinement. The resource requirements of the voyage shrink dramatically. The governance and cultural transmission challenges become far more manageable with a small, coherent crew rather than a complex society of tens of thousands. On paper, it is an extraordinarily elegant solution. But here's where the conversation takes a turn that no engineering analysis can resolve, because the embryo ship concept, for all its technical elegance, raises ethical questions that cut to the absolute core of what we believe about human dignity, consent, and what it means to bring a person into the world. The children produced at the destination from that biorepository will not have parents in any conventional sense. They will not have been born of a relationship, of a family, of a community that knew them before they existed and wanted them and was prepared to receive them as individuals. They will have been produced deliberately, systematically, at scale, as colonists, as the human material required to populate a new world. as means to an end that was chosen by people who lived and died before their gestation even began, is that acceptable? Is it meaningfully different from the ethical situation of children born on a conventional generation ship who also did not consent to their circumstances and also exist in service of a mission they did not choose? Some philosophers argue it is different in a crucial way. The embryo shipchild was not just born into an unchosen situation, but was specifically created for one. Their existence itself is instrumental to a project rather than incidental to it. Others argue that this distinction is less morally significant than it initially appears, that parents throughout history have had children with intentions and purposes that shape those children's lives profoundly without thereby violating their dignity. The debate is live, serious, and unresolved. It involves some of the most careful thinkers working in bioethics today, and it will need to reach some kind of working consensus before any embryo ship concept moves from theoretical proposal to actual mission planning. But the embryo ship is not the most radical proposal on the table, not even close, because there is a third path, one that sidesteps the biological constraints of the human body entirely, and that forces a confrontation with questions that philosophy and science are only just beginning to have the vocabulary to seriously engage with. What if the entity that makes the journey isn't biological at all? Not in the science fiction sense of robots replacing human beings, but in a sense that is philosophically far more subtle and far more disquieting, the possibility of mind uploading or whole brain emulation. The idea that the pattern of information that constitutes a human consciousness, the memories, the personality, the emotional responses, the continuous thread of subjective experience that makes you could, in principle, be extracted from a biological brain and instantiated in a different substrate, a computational system that runs the same informational pattern on different physical hardware. If that were possible, and it is currently not, and may not be for a very long time, and whether it is theoretically possible at all, remains genuinely contested among philosophers and neuroscientists. Then a generation ship could carry the people of a civilization as pure information. No biological bodies requiring food, air, radiation shielding, or gravity. No aging, no death during transit, no generational succession. The same individuals, or something that from the inside is indistinguishable from the same individuals, arrive at the destination that departed from Earth. The philosophical problems with this are enormous and fascinating. If you copy the pattern of your consciousness onto a computational substrate and then step into a scanner, are you the same person as the one running on the computer? Or is the uploaded version a new entity that merely believes it is you because it has access to all your memories? If both versions exist simultaneously, if the biological you and the digital you are running at the same time, which one is the real continuation of your identity? These are not merely academic puzzles. They are questions that any civilization seriously contemplating mind uploading as a survival strategy would need to answer in practical, legally binding, socially negotiated terms. Because the answers determine whether the people who arrive at the destination have any meaningful continuity of identity with the people who chose to leave, and whether the mission, in any human sense, was worth it. There's a fourth approach that threads between these extremes in a way that some researchers find more practically plausible than any of the others. And it involves a technology that is already real, already advancing rapidly, and already generating serious ethical debate in mainstream scientific and medical contexts: genetic engineering, not the crude, imprecise genetic modification of early biotechnology, but the precise, targeted genome editing made possible by tools like CRISPR-Cas9, which allows researchers to make specific, predictable changes to DNA sequences with an accuracy and efficiency that was simply impossible a decade ago. The first CRISPR-edited babies, twin girls whose genomes were modified as embryos by Chinese researcher He Jiankui in 2018, in an experiment that was almost universally condemned by the scientific community as premature and unethical, demonstrated both the power of the technology and the profound dangers of applying it to human germline editing without adequate safety data and ethical oversight. But the scientific capability is real and advancing, and the question of whether genetic engineering of the generation ship's founding population or of embryos carried in the biorepository could be used to address some of the mission's most serious biological challenges is being discussed seriously in the literature, even if the ethical barriers to actually doing it are currently very high: increased radiation resistance, enhanced DNA repair mechanisms, more efficient metabolic processing of recycled nutrients, reduced susceptibility to the psychological effects of confinement, greater cognitive flexibility in novel situations. Every one of these traits, if it could be reliably engineered into the founding population without introducing harmful side effects, a very large if would meaningfully improve the mission's odds of success. And here's the dimension of this that tends to stop people cold when they fully absorb it. Once you start genetically modifying the founding population of a generation ship for mission-relevant traits, you are not just solving a technical problem, you are deciding deliberately and in advance what kind of human beings will exist at the end of the voyage. You are shaping, through intentional design, the evolutionary future of a branch of the human species, a branch that, once separated from Earth by light years and centuries, will have no practical means of reconnecting with the mainstream of human biological development. The ship's population and the Earth's population will diverge biologically, cognitively, potentially in ways that, after enough generations, would make meaningful reproduction between the two branches difficult or impossible. You are not just sending humanity to another star, you are potentially creating a new species, intentionally, by design, before the mission even launches. And this is where the conversation arrives at a place of genuine, profound ambiguity, the kind that serious scientists and philosophers sit with rather than resolve, because the honest answer is that we don't yet know enough to resolve it. Every solution to the generation ship problem comes with costs. Suspended animation buys time but doesn't eliminate the fundamental challenges. It defers them and compresses them into the active periods. The embryo ship solves the resource and psychology problems, but creates human beings as instruments of a project rather than as ends in themselves. Mind uploading, if it ever becomes possible, raises questions about identity and consciousness that our current philosophical frameworks are not equipped to answer. Genetic engineering shapes the future of a branch of humanity according to the values and priorities of the people who design the mission, values and priorities that may look very different from the perspective of the people who result from those choices. None of these is a clean answer. All of them are genuinely fascinating, and all of them are being thought about seriously right now by real researchers at real institutions with real funding, because the question of how humanity might one day travel between the stars is no longer considered purely speculative. The James Webb Space Telescope has given us images of planetary atmospheres in other solar systems. Ground-based observatories have detected biosignature candidates, chemical signatures that might indicate the presence of life, in the atmospheres of exoplanets. The European Space Agency's Pilato mission, scheduled for launch in 2026, is designed specifically to find and characterize Earth-like planets in the habitable zones of Sun-like stars. We are building, right now, the observational infrastructure that will tell us whether there are worlds worth going to. And the question of how we might actually get there and what we would have to become to make the journey is one that the universe seems increasingly insistent on forcing us to confront. But there's one more dimension of the generation ship story that we haven't touched yet, one that operates at a level deeper than biology, deeper than governance, deeper than technology. A dimension that goes to the heart of what the universe itself has to say about the project of moving life between the stars, because the cosmos is not a neutral backdrop to this story. It is an active participant, and it has been running its own version of the generation ship experiment for billions of years, scattering the chemistry of life across the galaxy through a process so vast and so ancient that our own existence might be one of its outcomes. The science behind this idea is called Panspermia, and what it tells us about life, about the universe, and about the meaning of the journey we're contemplating is both humbling and, in the deepest possible sense, extraordinary. In 2019, a team of Japanese researchers fired a small explosive charge into the surface of a near-Earth asteroid called Ryugu. The charge was carried by a spacecraft called Hayabusa 2, built by the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, and the explosion was designed to excavate fresh material from beneath the asteroid's surface, material that had never been exposed to the solar wind, never been altered by billions of years of surface chemistry, never touched by anything since the earliest days of the solar system. The samples that Hayabusa 2 collected and returned to Earth in December of that same year contained something that stopped researchers cold when they analyzed them in the laboratory: organic molecules. Not just simple carbon compounds, but uracil, one of the 4 nucleobases that form the informational alphabet of RNA, the molecule that many researchers believe preceded DNA as the carrier of genetic information in the earliest living systems on Earth. They also found niacin, vitamin B3, which plays a fundamental role in cellular metabolism across virtually every form of life on our planet. These molecules formed in space, in the cold, radiation-drenched, seemingly sterile environment of the early solar system, on a rock that has been drifting between the inner planets for 4.5 billion years. Without liquid water, without any of the conditions that we have traditionally considered necessary for the chemistry of life to occur. And Ryugu is not unique. Amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, the molecular machines that carry out virtually every function in a living cell, have been found in meteorites recovered from Antarctica, from the Australian outback, from laboratories across the world that have analyzed material that fell from space. The Murchison meteorite, which landed in Victoria, Australia in 1969, has yielded over 90 different amino acids, including many that are used in biology here on Earth, and many that are not found in any living organism but demonstrate that the chemistry of life's building blocks is not an accident of Earth's particular conditions. It is a natural product of the universe's chemistry, occurring spontaneously wherever the right elements and energy sources come together. The universe, it turns out, is extraordinarily good at making the ingredients of life. The question of whether it is equally good at spreading life itself, at moving living organisms between star systems, is what panspermia is actually about. The concept of panspermia, the idea that life, or the seeds of life, can travel through space and seed new worlds, has a history in scientific thinking that stretches back to the ancient Greeks. But it entered serious modern scientific discourse in the late 19th century through the work of Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius, who proposed in 1903 that bacterial spores could be propelled through interstellar space by the pressure of starlight itself, a mechanism he called radiopanspermia. Arrhenius's specific mechanism has been largely abandoned. Starlight pressure is insufficient to accelerate spores to interstellar velocities within any useful time frame. and the radiation environment of interstellar space would almost certainly sterilize an unprotected spore before it could cross the gulf between stars. But the broader idea that life might move between astronomical bodies has never gone away. It has instead become increasingly credible as our understanding of microbial biology, orbital mechanics, and the deep history of life on Earth has developed. The version of panspermia that most researchers today consider at least plausible, and that some consider likely, is called lithopanspermia. It proposes not that living organisms travel naked through space, but that they travel protected inside rocks, inside the fragments of planetary material that are blasted into space by large asteroid and comet impacts, carrying microbial passengers shielded by meters of solid rock from the radiation of interstellar space, potentially viable for far longer than any exposed organism could survive. And we know this mechanism works in at least one direction. We have rocks from Mars sitting in Antarctic ice right now, meteorites that were blasted off the Martian surface by ancient impacts and eventually drifted into Earth-crossing orbits. The most famous of these, ALH 8401, collected in 1984, sparked one of the most intense scientific controversies of the 1990s when NASA researchers announced in 1996 that it appeared to contain microscopic structures that might be fossilized bacterial remnants. The announcement, made at a press conference attended by then-President Bill Clinton, who described it as one of the most stunning insights into our universe that science has ever uncovered, was met with immediate and sustained scientific skepticism. The structures in ALH 8401 are now generally considered to be inorganic in origin, the result of chemical processes rather than biological ones, but the rock itself is unquestionably from Mars. Material from Mars has reached Earth. The delivery mechanism is real, so how long can a living organism actually survive inside a rock traveling through space? The answer, based on laboratory experiments and natural observations, is simultaneously more and less reassuring than you might expect. Bacterial spores, the dormant, metabolically inactive survival forms produced by certain types of bacteria, are genuinely extraordinary objects. Species like Bacillus subtilis produce spores that can survive extreme desiccation, extreme temperature swings, ultraviolet radiation, and chemical environments that would kill any actively metabolizing cell instantly. In laboratory conditions, spores have been successfully revived after periods of dormancy extending to tens of millions of years, though claims at the extreme end of this range remain contested and the subject of ongoing research. The 2018 revival of bacteria from 250-million-year-old salt crystals, reported by researchers at Westchester University, remains one of the most striking and debated findings in the entire history of astrobiology. Inside a rock shielded from ultraviolet radiation by even a thin layer of mineral material, and from cosmic rays by a few meters of dense stone, the survival window extends dramatically. Computer models of lithopanspermia trajectories, tracking how long a rock ejected from one planetary surface would take to reach another, and what radiation environment it would experience during that transit, suggest that transfer between planets within the same solar system is genuinely feasible for hardy microbial life. Transfer between adjacent star systems is far more difficult. The timescales are millions to tens of millions of years, and even the most radiation-resistant organisms known face profound uncertainty over such timescales. But here's the number that makes researchers pause. There are, by current estimates, roughly 10 to the power of 24 stars in the observable universe. That's 1 followed by 24 zeros, a number so large that it effectively resists human intuition. Even if the probability of successful interstellar lithopanspermia between any two given star systems is vanishingly small, 1 in a trillion, 1 in a quadrillion. The sheer number of opportunities across the full extent of the universe means that successful transfers are not just possible, but statistically inevitable, given enough time. And the universe has had a great deal of time, roughly 13.8 billion years of it. There is a more specific and more startling version of the Panspermia hypothesis that some researchers take seriously, one that doesn't just propose that life's chemistry is common throughout the universe, but makes a claim about our own origin that is deeply relevant to the generation ship story. It is called the weak Panspermia hypothesis, and it suggests that life on Earth may have been seeded, or at minimum, substantially influenced by biological material that originated elsewhere. Not necessarily from another star system, but potentially from another body within our own solar system, most plausibly Mars, which formed earlier than Earth, cooled faster, and may have developed liquid water on its surface and potentially habitable conditions hundreds of millions of years before Earth did. If life arose on Mars first, if the first self-replicating molecular systems emerged in Martian hydrothermal environments or subsurface liquid water while Earth was still being bombarded by the heavy meteoritic rain of the late heavy bombardment, and if fragments of Martian rock carrying those first primitive organisms were subsequently transferred to early Earth by impact ejection, then every living thing on this planet might be, in the most literal biological sense, Martian. The data needed to confirm or refute this hypothesis definitively doesn't yet exist. But the instruments that could gather it are either already on Mars or on their way. NASA's Perseverance rover, currently operating in Jezero Crater, a location selected specifically because it preserves geological evidence of an ancient river delta and lake system, is collecting rock core samples that will be returned to Earth by a future sample return mission jointly developed by NASA and the European Space Agency. Analysis of those samples in terrestrial laboratories with the full suite of instruments available to modern astrobiology could finally answer the question of whether Mars ever hosted life, and if so, whether that life shares biochemical characteristics with life on Earth that would suggest a common origin. The implications of a positive finding would be staggering, not just philosophically, not just for the history of life on Earth, but for the generation ship question specifically. Because if life has already crossed the void between planets, if biology has already proven itself capable of surviving interstellar or at least interplanetary transfer, then the generation ship is not humanity's first attempt at this. It is a conscious, intentional repetition of something that the universe has been doing blindly and automatically for billions of years. We would not be pioneers crossing a frontier that life has never crossed before. We would be latecomers, using deliberate technology to replicate a process that chemistry and physics have been executing through sheer scale and probability since the first rocky planets formed around the first generation of stars. This realization does something profound to the emotional texture of the generation ship story. We began this video with the image of 10,000 human beings sealed inside a metal vessel, moving through the dark between the stars, facing a cascade of challenges so severe that the mission's success seems almost miraculous to contemplate. And that image is accurate. The challenges are real, the stakes are genuine, and the obstacles we've traced across 6 parts of this video are as serious as anything our species has ever confronted. But zoom out. Zoom out past the ship, past the solar system, past the local stellar neighborhood, to the scale at which the universe conducts its own version of this experiment, and the picture changes. Life, or at minimum the chemistry that produces life, appears to be a natural consequence of the universe's fundamental physics and chemistry. It emerges wherever conditions permit. It is robust enough to survive in environments that our intuitions, shaped by the comfortable conditions of Earth's surface, consider utterly hostile. It has been distributed across at least one planetary system, ours, by the same random violence of impact and ejection that makes planetary surfaces dangerous. And it has had 13.8 billion years to work with, across a universe containing more stars than there are grains of sand on every beach on Earth combined. We are not an accident in a sterile cosmos. We are, in the most literal scientific sense available to us right now, an expression of the universe's deep tendency toward complexity, chemistry, and perhaps life. And the generation ship, whatever its challenges, is the moment when that tendency becomes conscious of itself, when the blind, automatic, probabilistic process by which life spreads becomes a deliberate, intentional, reasoned act, when the universe, through us, chooses to do what it has been doing by accident for billions of years, but this time on purpose. That is not a small thing. That is, arguably, one of the most significant transitions in the 4-billion-year history of life on this planet. But consciousness comes with a weight that blind chemistry doesn't carry. It comes with the awareness of everything that can go wrong. With the knowledge of every challenge we've traced across this video, the genetics, the radiation, the psychology, the governance, the cultural transmission, the biological transformation across generations. With the understanding that the universe's blind process of spreading life doesn't care whether the organisms survive or not, doesn't mourn the failures, doesn't remember the attempts that ended in the cold dark between stars with no one left to tell the story. We do care, we do mourn, we do remember. And that capacity to hold the full weight of what this journey costs against the full wonder of what it might achieve is precisely what makes us different from the tardigrade in the cosmic ray stream, from the bacterial spore inside the Martian rock, from every other vehicle the universe has used to carry the chemistry of life across the void. It is what makes us human, and it raises, with a force that grows as this video approaches its final chapters, the question that underlies everything we have discussed. Not can we do this? The engineering answers will come with time and investment and ingenuity. Not should we do this? The ethics will be argued, negotiated, and eventually worked through by people far wiser and more informed than any of us alive today. The question is simpler and stranger and more personal than either of those. It is this: what are we actually sending? When a generation ship finally launches, and if the trajectory of both space technology and Earth's environmental and geopolitical stability continues on its current path, it seems less a question of whether than of when. What exactly boards that vessel? What is the thing that leaves? What crosses the void? What arrives 1,000 years later on the surface of a world that no human being has ever touched? Is it humanity? Is it a branch of humanity? Is it something that was human when it left and is something new when it arrives? Is it the people who board the ship, or the idea of the people who board the ship, carried forward through 40 generations of biological and cultural transformation? Is it us? These questions don't have clean answers. They may never have clean answers, but they have a context, a scientific, historical, philosophical context that makes them feel less like abstract speculation and more like the most urgent and concrete questions that our species currently faces, because we are not, in 2026, simply imagining these possibilities from the safe distance of pure theory. The James Webb Space Telescope has been returning data for several years now that has repeatedly surprised, and in some cases genuinely shocked, astrophysicists with its implications for our understanding of planetary formation, atmospheric chemistry, and the distribution of potentially habitable environments across the galaxy. Telescopes currently under construction, including the extremely large telescope being built by the European Southern Observatory on a mountaintop in the Atacama Desert of Chile, with a primary mirror 39 meters across, will have the light-gathering capacity to directly image Earth-sized planets around nearby stars and analyze their atmospheric composition with a precision that was science fiction just a decade ago. We are building the eyes that will tell us where to go. And simultaneously, in laboratories and research institutions across the world, the foundational science of getting there, suspended animation biology, closed-loop ecological systems, radiation shielding materials, genetic preservation technologies, artificial womb development, is advancing on every front simultaneously, driven by a combination of space agency funding, private investment, and the simple, relentless pressure of scientific curiosity. The generation ship is not 1,000 years away from being a real possibility. Some researchers believe it could be a serious engineering project within a century. Others think 2 or 3 centuries is more realistic. But the direction of travel is clear. The question is no longer whether this is possible in principle. It is becoming a question of when and how and at what cost. And that means the questions we've been sitting with across this video, the genetics and the radiation and the psychology and the governance and the cultural transmission and the biological transformation, are not historical curiosities or science fiction thought experiments. They are design problems, real ones, with real solutions being worked on by real people right now, with real money and real careers and real institutional commitment behind them. The generation ship will be built. Not by us, probably, not by our children, possibly, but by someone who is descended from the civilization we are building today, using tools that grow from the science we are doing right now, in service of an impulse that has been part of what we are since the first human being looked at the horizon and felt the pull of what was beyond it. We are stardust that has learned to wonder about the stars it came from, and the generation ship is the moment when that wonder becomes a vessel. But there's one more thing we haven't talked about yet. One more dimension of this story that sits beneath everything else we've discussed, patient and quiet and enormous, waiting for the moment when it can no longer be ignored. What happens if the ship arrives and the planet isn't what they expected? What happens if the atmospheric chemistry is wrong? If the gravity is subtly different in ways that matter biologically? If there is life already there, microbial, complex, or something in between, that the arriving population's immune systems and ecosystems have no experience of? What happens if, after 1,000 years, the destination turns out not to be a home? If you are still watching, then this channel was created for you. Make sure to give a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. We always go somewhere new and come back seeing a little more than we did before. Here is a number that should reframe everything you think you know about finding another Earth. Of the more than 5,500 exoplanets confirmed by astronomers as of the time this video was made, roughly a few dozen sit within what scientists call the habitable zone of their host star, the range of orbital distances where liquid water could theoretically exist on a planetary surface. A few dozen worlds, out of thousands examined, that pass the most basic geometric filter for potential habitability, now apply the next filter. Not every star is like our Sun. Roughly 70% of all stars in the Milky Way are red dwarfs, smaller, cooler, dimmer stars that burn their hydrogen far more slowly and live far longer than Sun-like stars. Red dwarfs are so common that the nearest star to our own solar system and several of the most frequently discussed exoplanet targets are red dwarfs. And planets in the habitable zone of a red dwarf face a set of conditions so different from what Earth experiences that habitable zone becomes almost misleading as a descriptor. Because a red dwarf's habitable zone is so close to the star, sometimes closer than Mercury orbits our Sun, that planets within it are almost certainly tidally locked. one face permanently toward the star, baking in perpetual scorching light, the other face permanently away, frozen in permanent night. Between them, a thin twilight band where temperatures might be survivable, but where the atmospheric dynamics, driven by the extreme temperature gradient between the day and night sides, would produce wind patterns and pressure systems unlike anything in Earth's meteorological history. And that's before you factor in the flares. Red dwarfs are extraordinarily active stars, particularly in their youth, which, given that they live for tens to hundreds of billions of years, means youth can extend for several billion years. They produce stellar flares with a frequency and intensity that dwarfs anything our comparatively stable sun generates. These flares blast the surfaces of nearby planets with ultraviolet radiation and energetic particles at levels that would sterilize an unprotected surface and, over geological timescales, strip away planetary atmospheres entirely. TRAPPIST-1, the red dwarf system that generated enormous excitement when astronomers announced in 2017 that it hosts 7 Earth-sized planets. 3 of them potentially in the habitable zone, is one of the most studied exoplanet systems in the history of astronomy. Data from the James Webb Space Telescope, released in 2023 and 2024, has begun characterizing these planets in detail that was previously impossible. The results have been sobering. TRAPPIST-1b, the innermost planet, appears to have little or no atmosphere. TRAPPIST-1c, the second planet, shows no evidence of a thick carbon dioxide atmosphere that would be expected if it were broadly Earth-like. The data suggests that the intense radiation environment of TRAPPIST-1 may have stripped these planets of the atmospheric protection that life as we know it requires. This doesn't mean the outer TRAPPIST-1 planets are uninhabitable. The data isn't yet conclusive, and the James Webb Telescope is continuing to observe the system. But it illustrates, with real numbers from real observations, how much more demanding the bar for genuine habitability is than the simple geometric filter of "in the habitable zone" implies. Now put a generation ship crew into this picture. After 1,000 years of travel, after everything we've traced across the previous 7 parts of this video, the genetic drift, the radiation exposure, the psychological transformation, the cultural evolution, the biological adaptation to an artificial environment, the people who finally approach their destination will be doing so with instruments, telescopes, and observational data that were collected during the voyage. Some of that data will be good, some of it will be ambiguous, and some of the most critical questions about whether the target planet can actually support human life will not be answerable from a distance. You cannot fully characterize a planetary surface from orbit. You cannot know the microbiology of a world's soil from spectroscopic analysis alone. You cannot measure the precise atmospheric pressure at ground level, the exact chemical composition of the water in a potential lake or ocean, the toxicological profile of the dust that blows across the surface, or the biological activity, if any, of the organisms that might inhabit it. From a spacecraft in orbit several thousand kilometers above, at some point someone has to go down. And that moment, the first descent to the surface of another world after 1,000 years of travel, is one of the most dangerous moments of the entire mission, not because of any dramatic sudden peril, though those exist, but because of the invisible biological encounter that begins the instant the hatch opens and the air of another world touches a human body for the first time. Let's talk about what that air might actually contain. Astrobiologists who study the conditions for life beyond Earth operate within a framework built around what they call the requirements for life as we know it: liquid water, a source of energy, organic carbon chemistry, and a stable environment over geological timescales. These requirements are derived entirely from the one example of life we actually have access to, life on Earth. And while this framework is scientifically reasonable, given the data available, it carries an assumption that researchers are always careful to acknowledge. We don't know that life elsewhere uses the same chemistry as life on Earth. It probably does, at the most fundamental level. Carbon's chemical versatility makes it the overwhelmingly likely backbone of any complex chemistry capable of producing self-replicating systems, and water's properties as a solvent are difficult to replace with any other readily available molecule. But at the level above raw chemistry, at the level of specific biochemical pathways, specific molecular architectures, specific metabolic strategies, life on another world could differ from life on Earth in ways that are impossible to predict from first principles. And those differences matter enormously for a generation ship crew attempting to survive on the surface of that world. Consider the chirality problem. Almost all biological molecules on Earth exist in one of two mirror image forms, like left and right hands, and life on Earth uses almost exclusively one form. Amino acids in terrestrial biology are left-handed, sugars are right-handed. If life on another world uses the opposite chirality, or if it uses a mixture, the biochemical interactions between terrestrial biology and alien biology could be deeply unpredictable. Enzymes that evolved to break down left-handed amino acids would be useless against right-handed ones. Nutritional molecules in alien organisms might be indigestible, or worse, metabolically disruptive. This is not a theoretical concern invented for science fiction. The chirality of biological molecules is a real active area of astrobiology research, and the question of how terrestrial biology would interact with a differently chiral biosphere is taken seriously in the literature. But chirality is just one dimension of the biological encounter problem. The more fundamental issue is the immune system. Your immune system is the product of 4 billion years of evolutionary arms race between vertebrate biology and the microbial world that has surrounded and inhabited it throughout that entire history. Every pathogen that ever infected your ancestors, every parasite that ever challenged their survival, every environmental microorganism that ever made contact with their tissues, the cumulative record of all those encounters is written into the architecture of your immune defenses, your antibodies, your T cells, your complement system, your innate immune responses. All of them are calibrated to recognize and respond to the specific molecular signatures of the biological world that your lineage evolved alongside. An alien microbial world has none of those signatures. Its organisms, if they are organisms in any recognizable sense, carry molecular structures that your immune system has never encountered and has no prepared response to. Your pattern recognition receptors, which identify threats by detecting molecular signatures shared by broad classes of terrestrial microorganisms, might not trigger at all in response to alien biology, or they might trigger inappropriately, mounting inflammatory responses to harmless alien molecules while missing genuinely dangerous ones entirely. The history of what happens when isolated human populations encounter unfamiliar microbial ecosystems, even ecosystems produced by other terrestrial biology, is a sobering guide. When European colonists arrived in the Americas beginning in the late 1500s, the diseases they carried, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, devastated indigenous populations that had no prior exposure to these pathogens and therefore no acquired immunity to them. Mortality rates in some communities reached 90% within a generation, not because the diseases were uniquely lethal in an absolute sense. They killed people in Europe too, but at far lower rates because European populations had developed partial immunity through centuries of exposure, but because the absence of prior immunological experience left entire populations biologically defenseless. Now imagine that scenario in reverse. A generation ship crew arriving on a biologically active world with immune systems shaped by 1,000 years of exposure only to the carefully managed microbial ecology of a closed spacecraft, encountering for the first time the full biological complexity of a living planetary surface, the crew's microbiome, the community of microorganisms living within and on their bodies, which, as we noted a while ago, will have drifted substantially from its Earth baseline over 1,000 years of closed environment living, will suddenly encounter an alien microbial world of incomprehensible diversity. The interactions between the ship's microbial ecosystem and the planet's could be anything from mutually neutral to catastrophically destabilizing in either direction. Alien organisms colonizing human gut environments, terrestrial organisms contaminating and potentially disrupting alien ecosystems. A two-way biological encounter whose outcomes no model, however sophisticated, can reliably predict. And this raises a dimension of the arrival problem that goes beyond the immediate survival of the crew. A dimension with profound ethical implications that the generation ship's planners will need to confront long before the vessel launches. What if the planet isn't lifeless? What if the world at the end of the 1,000-year voyage hosts life, microbial life, complex life, or something in between? That has its own evolutionary history, its own ecological relationships, its own 4-billion-year story of emergence and adaptation. The question of what moral obligations a generation ship crew would have toward alien life, particularly microbial alien life, which would be the most likely form given what we understand about the distribution of biological complexity, is one that the field of astrobiology takes seriously and that no consensus has yet emerged around. On one hand, the crew's survival may depend on the resources of that planet, its atmosphere, its water, its mineral wealth, potentially even its organic chemistry. They cannot go back. They have nowhere else to go. The alternative to using the planet's resources is death for the entire population, for everyone born on the ship across 1,000 years of sacrifice and effort and survival against extraordinary odds. On the other hand, if that planet hosts life, even microbial life, even life so primitive that it would be invisible to the naked eye, then it represents something of incalculable scientific and potentially moral significance. It is the second independent origin of life in the universe, or at least in our galaxy. It is proof that life is not a singular cosmic accident, but a recurring phenomenon. Its study alone, understanding how its biochemistry differs from or resembles terrestrial life, tracing the evolutionary path it has taken, mapping the ecological relationships it has built, would be among the most important scientific endeavors in the history of intelligent inquiry. And introducing terrestrial biology into that world, even inadvertently, even with the best possible containment protocols, would inevitably contaminate it. The terrestrial microorganisms carried in human bodies, on human skin, in human breath, would begin interacting with the alien biosphere the moment the hatch opened. Some would die immediately in the alien chemical environment. Others might find it hospitable. Some alien organisms might thrive on novel nutrients provided by terrestrial biology. Others might be devastated by it. The contamination, once begun, cannot be reversed. It cannot be recalled. It is permanent, irreversible, and potentially civilization ending for the alien biosphere. This is the planetary protection problem applied at its most extreme scale. NASA currently operates a planetary protection policy for all its missions, a set of protocols designed to prevent terrestrial contamination of other solar system bodies and to prevent potential alien contamination of Earth. For robotic missions, these protocols involve sterilization procedures, containment systems, and carefully designed mission profiles that minimize the risk of biological transfer. For a generation ship carrying 10,000 living human beings to a potentially inhabited world, no sterilization protocol in existence is remotely adequate. The crew is the contamination risk. Their existence on the planet is biologically inseparable from the introduction of terrestrial life into the alien environment. Some researchers who grapple with this problem have arrived at a proposal that is simultaneously the most scientifically rigorous and the most humanly devastating response to the contamination dilemma: don't land. If the target planet shows evidence of life, even marginal, ambiguous evidence, don't send anyone to the surface. Establish orbital habitats. Study the planet from a safe distance. Use robotic systems for surface exploration and sample collection with rigorous containment protocols. Accept that the destination of the 1,000-year voyage is a world the arriving population can observe but not inhabit, not because of any failure of courage or technology, but because the ethical obligation to preserve what might be a unique biological heritage in the universe outweighs the mission's original goal of physical settlement for the people who have been born, lived, and aged inside that ship, for the people who represent the 43rd or 44th generation of an unbroken line of sacrifice made in service of the promise of a new home. That decision, arrived at by telescopic observation during the final approach, would be one of the most devastating moments in the entire history of any civilization. The destination exists. The planet is real. They can see it from orbit, blue and green, and wrapped in cloud, beautiful and impossible, and permanently out of reach, and they cannot go down. There is, of course, another possibility, one that doesn't require a choice between contamination and permanent orbital exile, one that several researchers have begun discussing seriously in the context of both generation ship planning and the broader question of how humanity might eventually establish a presence across multiple star systems. Terraforming, the deliberate, large-scale modification of a planet's atmosphere, surface chemistry, and temperature to bring it within the range of conditions that terrestrial biology, and eventually human beings, can survive in. If the target planet is uninhabited, a world with the right raw materials but no biology of its own, then terraforming is not just ethically unproblematic, but potentially the most practical path to a genuinely habitable surface. And the science of how it might be done, at least in principle, is more developed than most people realize. The most extensively studied terraforming target is Mars. Researchers including the late Carl Sagan, Christopher McKay of NASA Ames Research Center, and Martin Fogg, author of the 1996 textbook Terraforming, Engineering Planetary Environments, have been developing theoretical frameworks for Mars terraforming for decades. The basic concept involves warming the planet through a combination of orbital mirrors, introduced greenhouse gases, and the release of volatiles currently locked in the polar ice caps, to the point where liquid water can exist on the surface. Then introducing photosynthetic organisms, cyanobacteria, algae, that can begin producing atmospheric oxygen through the same biological process that oxygenated Earth's atmosphere 2.4 billion years ago. Then, over timescales of centuries to millennia, gradually building an ecosystem from the ground up. The timescales involved are staggering. Realistic estimates for warming Mars to the point where liquid water could persist on its surface range from a few centuries to many thousands of years, depending on the methods used. Producing a breathable oxygen atmosphere could take many thousands of years beyond that. A generation ship arriving at a Mars-like uninhabited world would not be terraforming it for themselves. They would be beginning a process that their own distant descendants might eventually benefit from, continuing, in a sense, the generational mission that brought them there in the first place. There is something deeply resonant about that image. a civilization that crossed 1,000 years of interstellar darkness to reach a new world, and then commits itself to another 1,000 years of patient, deliberate transformation of that world, not for themselves, but for the generations that will follow them. A project whose completion they will never see, pursued in the same spirit that the founders of the generation ship pursued the voyage itself. Humanity has always built for futures it would not live to inhabit, cathedrals that took centuries to complete, forests planted by grandparents for grandchildren they would never meet, scientific projects designed to run for generations, gathering data that only the distant future would know how to interpret. The generation ship is that impulse at its most extreme, and terraforming at the other end of the journey is its continuation. But there's a thread running through this entire discussion. From the moment the ship separates from Earth's gravity well, to the moment the first person finally stands on the surface of a world that no human being has ever touched, that we haven't yet followed to its conclusion. It's the thread of identity, of what we are and what we're carrying, and whether those things survive the crossing intact. We are not just flesh and bone and genome. We are memory, we are story. We are the accumulated understanding of what the universe is and where we fit within it, an understanding built over centuries of scientific inquiry, philosophical reflection, artistic creation, and the patient, humble practice of looking at the cosmos and trying to describe honestly what we see. That understanding, the scientific picture of the universe that represents our civilization's most reliable map of reality, is the most precious cargo a generation ship could carry, more precious than genetic diversity, more critical than technical knowledge, more fundamental than any governance structure or social institution, because everything else can, in principle, be rebuilt from it. From a genuine understanding of physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, and the philosophical frameworks that allow us to reason about our own existence, a civilization can reconstruct almost anything it has lost. The tools, the technologies, the institutions, the art, all of it can be regenerated from a foundation of deep scientific understanding applied with human ingenuity and will. Lose that understanding, let it erode through the generational transmission problems we explored, let it hollow out from genuine knowledge into empty ritual, and you lose the thing that makes recovery possible. The generation ship, at its deepest level, is not a vessel for carrying bodies to another star. It is a vessel for carrying minds, for carrying the hard-won, painstakingly assembled, perpetually self-correcting framework of understanding that allows a community of human beings to reason about reality, solve novel problems, and adapt to circumstances that no previous generation has ever faced. It is carrying, in the most literal sense, the capacity for science itself. The practice, not just the accumulated results, but the living practice of looking honestly at the universe, acknowledging what you don't know, following the evidence wherever it leads, and updating your understanding when the evidence demands it. That practice, sustained across 1,000 years of isolation, across 40 generations of people who were born into circumstances no human being has ever previously inhabited, facing challenges that no previous scientific tradition has ever had to address, is the real test of the generation ship, not the engineering, not the genetics, not the governance. The question is whether the practice of honest inquiry can survive the crossing, and whether the people who arrive, shaped by everything the voyage has made them, will look up at the alien sky above their new world and feel what their distant ancestors felt when they looked up at the night sky from the surface of a small blue planet in an unremarkable spiral arm of an average galaxy. That combination of awe and curiosity and connection and determination that is, perhaps, the most distinctively human thing there is. We are almost at the end of this story, but not quite, because there's one more chapter, the one that brings everything together, the one that takes everything we've explored across 8 parts of this video and asks the question that sits beneath all of it, not whether we can do this, not whether we should, but what it means, what it says about us, about the universe, about the relationship between the two, that we are the kind of thing that even asks these questions at all. There is a photograph taken on February 14th, 1990, that has never stopped meaning something to the people who have seen it and truly understood what they were looking at. A spacecraft called Voyager 1, launched in September of 1977 to study the outer planets of our solar system, had completed its primary mission and was heading out of the solar system entirely, moving away from the Sun at roughly 17 kilometers per second. At the request of astronomer Carl Sagan, the spacecraft's camera was turned back toward the inner solar system one final time, from a distance of roughly 6 billion kilometers, and a series of photographs was taken. In one of those photographs, against a band of scattered sunlight that crosses the image like a diagonal stripe of pale fire, there is a tiny point of light, barely a pixel, barely distinguishable from the noise of the imaging sensor. It is not a star. It is not a planet in any meaningful visual sense. It is a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. Sagan's own description in the speech he gave about this image that remains, decades later, one of the most quietly devastating pieces of scientific communication ever recorded. That mote of dust is Earth. Every human being who ever lived, every civilization that ever rose and fell, every act of courage and cruelty and love and discovery in the entire recorded history of our species, contained within a single pixel of reflected light, invisible against the scale of even our own solar system, to say nothing of the galaxy, to say nothing of the universe. Sagan's point, delivered with the gentle precision that characterized everything he did, was not despair. It was perspective. The kind of perspective that the generation ship forces on you, not as a philosophical exercise, but as a lived daily reality. The knowledge that you are small, that your world is small, that the distances between worlds are so vast that crossing them requires sacrificing generations of human lives to the attempt. And yet we are the thing in that pixel that knows it is small. We are the thing that pointed a camera backward from 6 billion kilometers away and looked at itself and felt something. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old, and as far as we currently know, as far as the most sensitive instruments ever built by any civilization have been able to determine, we are the only part of it that has ever done that. That is not a small thing. That might be the largest thing there is. The generation ship forces this realization into the foreground in a way that nothing else quite does, because it is not a thought experiment. It is not a philosophical proposition. It is an engineering project, a practical, material undertaking that requires resources and decisions and sacrifices from real people living in real time. And the people it requires the most from are not the engineers who design it, or the politicians who fund it, or the scientists who solve its technical challenges. They are the people who get on board. Think about what it means to volunteer for a generation ship. Not the people who will arrive. They have no choice. They will be born into the mission, but the founders, the first generation, the people who step through the airlock knowing that they will never step back through it, that every person they have ever loved who is not on board with them is someone they will never see again, that the world they are leaving, with all its chaos and beauty and familiarity and irritating specificity, is something they are choosing to exchange for a metal corridor and recycled air and a destination they will never reach. Why would anyone do that? The question is not rhetorical. It has been studied seriously by psychologists and anthropologists, examining the motivational profiles of people who volunteer for extreme isolation missions, Antarctic overwinter cruise, long-duration spaceflight candidates, submarine crews, participants in Mars simulation studies, and the answer that emerges from that research is not what you might expect. It is not primarily adventure-seeking. People who are primarily motivated by novelty and excitement tend to struggle in long-duration isolated environments precisely because the novelty wears off and what remains is the confinement. The people who do best, psychologically, socially, in terms of maintaining both individual well-being and group cohesion, tend to be people motivated by what researchers call prosocial purpose, a genuine, deeply held belief that what they are doing matters for reasons that extend beyond themselves, that their discomfort and sacrifice are meaningful because they serve something larger. This is not ideology. It is not religion, though religious frameworks have historically been among the most powerful vessels for this kind of motivation. It is something more fundamental, a basic human need to locate oneself within a story that has significance beyond the individual life. A need that is, as far as we can tell, universal across human cultures and throughout recorded history. Every society that has ever existed has had it. Every tradition of meaning-making, scientific, philosophical, artistic, spiritual, has been, in part, a response to it. The generationship is that need at its most naked. It strips away everything else and leaves only the question of whether you believe, genuinely and deeply, that the journey matters, that it is worth what it costs, that the destination, whatever it turns out to be, justifies the sacrifice of the only life you will ever have. The people who will actually build generation ships, whenever that happens, in whatever century it becomes technically and politically possible, will face a version of this question at every level of the project, not just the volunteers who board the vessel, but the civilization that funds and enables the mission, the scientists and engineers who spend their careers solving problems they will never see solved, the institutions that commit resources to a project whose payoff, if it comes at all, will arrive hundreds of years after every living participant is dead. This is not unprecedented. Human beings have always made investments whose returns they would never personally collect. The great cathedrals of medieval Europe took generations to build. The people who laid the foundations did not live to see the spires completed. The scientists who developed the theoretical framework for quantum mechanics could not have imagined the integrated circuits that their work eventually made possible. The people who planted the forests of Europe centuries ago did so knowing the trees would not mature in their lifetimes. What the generation ship requires is that same willingness to invest in a future you will not inhabit, but extended to a degree that makes every previous human example look modest by comparison. It asks not a generation or two of patience, but potentially 10 or 20 or 30. It asks for commitment to a project whose success cannot be verified by anyone alive at the time of commitment, and whose failure would be equally invisible to the civilization that launched it. And here is the philosophical dimension of this that researchers in the field of existential risk and long-term future studies have been wrestling with seriously for the past several decades. The generation ship is, in one sense, the ultimate expression of humanity's investment in its own long-term survival. It is the most extreme form of what philosopher William MacAskill, in his 2022 book, What We Owe the Future, calls long-termism, the idea that the most morally significant consideration in any decision is its impact on the vast number of potential future people whose existence depends on the choices made by those alive today. The numbers involved are staggering when you actually sit with them. If humanity survives for even a fraction of the remaining habitable lifespan of the Earth, roughly 1 billion years before the Sun's increasing luminosity renders the planet uninhabitable, and if the population remains at something like its current scale, then the number of future people whose existence depends on decisions made in the next century or two is so large that it effectively swamps any consideration of present welfare in a straightforward utilitarian calculation. This is not a comfortable way to think. It leads to conclusions that are both logically compelling and deeply counterintuitive. The idea that preventing the extinction of humanity might be, in a strict moral calculation, more important than any amount of present suffering because of the sheer scale of future existence that would be foreclosed by extinction. Critics of long-termism have raised serious and substantive objections to this framework, arguing that the uncertainty around future outcomes is too large to ground present moral decisions, that the framework can be used to justify almost any present sacrifice in the name of speculative future benefit, and that it systematically discounts the moral weight of people who actually exist now. The debate is live, serious, and unresolved, but the generation ship sits at its center, because a generation ship is, precisely, a decision made by present people on behalf of future people who cannot consent to it, in service of a long-term vision of human survival and flourishing that may or may not be realized. There is another way to look at this, one that sidesteps the utilitarian calculus entirely and approaches the generation ship from a direction that feels, to many people, more intuitively compelling than any abstract philosophical framework. It is the direction of curiosity itself, the most distinctively human capacity, the one that has driven everything from the first stone tools to the James Webb Space Telescope, from the earliest cave paintings to the most sophisticated mathematics ever conceived, is not intelligence exactly, though intelligence is part of it. It is not creativity, though creativity is essential to it. It is the specific combination of those things with a particular relationship to not knowing, with the ability to sit with uncertainty, to find it interesting rather than merely threatening, to be motivated by the existence of questions rather than paralyzed by the absence of answers. Every major advance in human understanding has been powered by that relationship to not knowing. The scientific method is, at its core, a formalization of the basic human impulse to ask what's actually true here, rather than what is comfortable to believe. The history of science is the history of that impulse winning over and over against the natural human preference for the familiar and the settled and the known. And the generation ship is an expression of that impulse at civilizational scale. It is a species saying, collectively, we don't know what's out there. We don't know whether the destination is habitable. We don't know what we'll find. We don't know who we'll be when we arrive. And we are going anyway, not despite the uncertainty, but because of it. Because the alternative, staying here, within the boundaries of what is known and familiar and manageable, declining the question the universe is asking, is, to the kind of thing that we are, a kind of slow spiritual death. Carl Sagan wrote in his 1994 book Pale Blue Dot that the cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. The generation ship is the moment when that self-knowing reaches the scale of interstellar distances, when the universe uses the mechanism of conscious, technological life to examine parts of itself that it has never been able to examine before, because those parts are too far away for any signal, except the deliberate, patient, multi-generational commitment of a species that decided the distance was worth crossing. But we need to be honest about something that all the awe and wonder and philosophical grandeur of the generation ship narrative can obscure if we let it. The people who will actually live through this, not the founders who chose it, not the distant descendants who arrive at the destination, but the people in the middle, the people of the 400th year and the 600th year and the 800th year, who were born inside metal walls and will die inside them, who never chose this life and have no meaningful option to leave it. Those people are not characters in an inspiring story. They are human beings living actual lives with actual needs for meaning and connection and dignity and the basic experience of being treated as ends in themselves rather than as links in a chain. The philosopher Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, the principle that human beings must always be treated as ends in themselves and never merely as means to an end, is not just a philosophical abstraction. It is a description of something real about the structure of human dignity, something that doesn't disappear because the project you're serving is genuinely important, something that makes demands on any civilization, any institution, any mission, however urgent its goals. The generation ship, if it is to be morally defensible rather than merely strategically compelling, has to find a way to honor the lives of the people who live through the middle of it, not just the founders who chose it, not just the arrivals who benefit from it, but the generations in between, who are neither the cause nor the conclusion of the great project, but the living substance of it, the actual human reality of what a 1,000-year voyage looks like from the inside. This means the ship's design, physical, social, political, psychological, has to be built around the well-being of its current inhabitants first and its mission goals second. Not because the mission doesn't matter, it matters enormously, but because a mission that grinds its people into suffering in service of a distant goal has already failed at the most fundamental level. Regardless of whether the ship eventually arrives, that is a design challenge, the most human one on the entire list, and it brings us back to the question that opened part 1 of this video, all those hours and ideas ago. Not can we build a generation ship? The answer is almost certainly yes, given enough time and resources and political will. The engineering problems are hard but not fundamentally impossible. The biology is challenging but not insurmountable. The physics, at least for the sub-relativistic speeds that current propulsion concepts could realistically achieve within the next century or two, is not prohibitive. The question, the real one, the one that will ultimately determine whether a generation ship is built and whether it succeeds, is this. Can we build a community that is worth living in across 1,000 years of isolation? Can we design a society that nourishes rather than destroys the people who inhabit it, that transmits knowledge and values and identity intact across 40 generations without calcifying into dogma, that governs itself fairly and adapts to circumstances its founders never anticipated, that treats every person born within its metal walls as a full human being deserving of a full human life? Can we build, in other words, a good society? This is not a novel question, it is the oldest question in political philosophy. Plato asked it, Aristotle asked it. Every political thinker from Cicero to Hobbes to Locke to Rawls has been asking some version of it, and the honest answer, drawn from 4,000 years of recorded human political experiment, is that we don't know how to do it perfectly. We have done it adequately sometimes. We have done it well in places and for periods. We have failed at it catastrophically with enormous human cost repeatedly. The generation ship would not magically solve the problem of how to build a good society, but it would force us to confront it with a seriousness and urgency that no earthly political project quite demands, because the consequences of failure would be so immediate, so total, and so irreversible. In that sense, the generation ship might be the best thing that ever happened to human political philosophy, not because it would produce the answers, but because it would finally make the questions impossible to avoid. Here is what we know, after everything explored across these 9 parts. We know that the biological challenges of a 1,000-year voyage are real and serious. Radiation, genetic drift, physiological adaptation, immune system evolution, but that none of them are beyond the reach of science and medicine given sufficient preparation and ongoing research. We know that the psychological and social challenges, confinement, loss of purpose across generations, governance failure, cultural erosion, are in some ways harder than the biological ones because they resist purely technical solutions and demand ongoing human wisdom and institutional commitment of a kind that is historically very difficult to sustain. We know that the proposed solutions, suspended animation, embryo ships, genetic engineering, mind uploading, each address some of these challenges while creating new ones, and that none of them can be evaluated on purely technical grounds because all of them raise ethical questions that engineering cannot answer. We know that arrival is not the end of the challenges, but the beginning of a new set, that the destination planet might be inhospitable, might be inhabited, might require centuries of terraforming before it can support a permanent human presence, and that the people who arrive will face those challenges as the products of 1,000 years of transformation, physically and culturally different from the civilization that launched them. And we know that the generation ship is, beneath all of its technical and ethical complexity, an expression of something that appears to be irreducibly part of what human beings are, the compulsion to go, to look, to find out, to cross the distance between here and the thing that calls to us from the other side of the dark. There is one more thing to say, one more piece of this story that pulls everything together in a way that I find, personally, to be the most quietly extraordinary fact in the entire conversation. Every element of the generation ship problem, every challenge we have discussed, every solution we have examined, every philosophical question we have raised is being worked on right now, today, by real people with real funding, in real institutions using real science. The biologists studying closed-loop ecological systems at NASA's Advanced Life Support Program, the cryobiologists at research universities around the world working on induced torpor, the geneticists cataloguing and preserving human genetic diversity against future need, the psychologists at ESA's Mars 500 simulations studying group dynamics in long-duration isolation, the ethicists at bioethics centers examining the moral frameworks that would govern a generation ship's social contract, the astronomers at ESO and NASA and JAXA building the telescopes that will tell us which worlds might be worth going to. None of these people think they are working on the generation ship. They are working on their particular piece of a very large puzzle driven by their own specific scientific questions and professional goals. But the pieces, assembled, form a picture that is unmistakably the outline of humanity's path toward the stars. The generation ship will not be built by a single grand decision at a single dramatic moment. It will emerge from the accumulation of thousands of individual scientific advances, each one modest in itself, that collectively reach the threshold where the mission becomes possible. That process is already underway. It has been underway in some sense since the first human being looked at the stars and wondered. We are not bystanders to this story. We are participants in it. Every one of us who has watched this video, who has sat with these ideas, who has felt the pull of the question and let themselves be changed a little by it. The civilization that will one day build a generation ship will build it from the culture its predecessors created, from the values they established and the questions they took seriously, and the wonder they chose to keep alive in themselves and pass on to the people who came after them. That is not nothing. That is, arguably, everything. Let's start with something small, not a spacecraft, not a telescope, not a philosophical proposition about the long-term future of intelligent life in the universe. Something much smaller than any of those things, and in a certain light, much more important, a conversation between a parent and a child, somewhere on Earth, on a clear night, when the conditions are right and the sky is dark enough and someone stops long enough to look up. You've probably had a version of this conversation. Maybe you were the child. Maybe you were the parent. Maybe you were just someone standing alone in a field or on a rooftop or at the edge of the ocean, and the night was clear and the Milky Way was visible as a pale smear across the sky, not the dramatic arch of a long exposure photograph, but the real thing, faint and diffuse and unmistakably there. And for a moment the ordinary texture of your life fell away, and you felt something that is very difficult to name precisely. Not quite awe, though awe is part of it. Not quite fear, though the scale of it contains something that borders on fear. Not quite loneliness, though the distance is involved. It is something more specific than any of those words, a kind of double sensation of being simultaneously very small and very significant, of being humbled by something and elevated by it at the same moment. That sensation has a scientific explanation. It is not mysticism, it is not illusion. It is your nervous system doing something that human nervous systems have apparently been capable of doing for as long as we have been human, registering the genuine scale of the universe and locating itself within it with something more nuanced than terror, responding to vastness with curiosity rather than just with fear. It is, as far as we currently know, unique, not just rare, not just impressive, genuinely, possibly cosmically unique. There is no confirmed evidence anywhere in the universe of any other system, biological or otherwise, that does this, that perceives scale and responds with wonder, that encounters mystery and is motivated by it rather than merely threatened. We do not know whether this capacity exists elsewhere in the universe. We have not found evidence that it does. The Fermi paradox, the famous observation by physicist Enrico Fermi that the universe is so vast and so old that if intelligent life were common, we should by now have some evidence of it, and we don't, remains one of the most unsettling open questions in all of science. Every proposed resolution to it has significant problems. The honest answer is that we don't know why the sky is silent, and that the silence could mean many different things, not all of them reassuring, but we know that we do this. Right here, right now, on this planet, in this moment of cosmic time. The generation ship, approached from this direction, looks different than it does when you approach it as an engineering problem or an ethical dilemma or a political challenge. Approached from this direction, it looks like a question the universe is asking itself, not metaphorically, not poetically, though the poetic dimension is real and worth honoring, literally, in the most scientifically grounded sense available. The universe has been producing complexity for 13.8 billion years, from the quantum fluctuations of the inflationary epoch, to the first hydrogen atoms, to the ignition of the first stars, to the nucleosynthesis of carbon and oxygen and iron in stellar interiors, to the dispersal of those elements in supernovae, to the formation of rocky planets around second-generation stars, to the emergence of self-replicating chemistry in warm, wet environments, to the slow ratchet of natural selection building biological complexity over billions of years. This entire process has been, in one framing, the universe organizing itself into increasingly complex configurations that are capable of increasingly sophisticated relationships with information, and at some point in this process, we don't know exactly when, we don't know exactly how, we don't know whether it has happened anywhere else. That complexity reached a threshold, and the universe began to know itself, to model itself, to build internal representations of its own structure and ask questions about those representations. We are that threshold, or at least one instance of it, and the question the universe seems to be asking, through us by putting us on a small rocky planet in a universe of hundreds of billions of galaxies, each containing hundreds of billions of stars, most of those stars with planets, and giving us the capacity to understand all of that, and the impulse to go toward it. The question seems to be, what will you do with this? The generation ship is one possible answer, not the only answer. Not necessarily the best answer for any particular moment in history, but an answer that takes the question seriously, that says, we understand what we are, we understand where we are, we understand that the universe is vast, and that the distances between worlds are real, and that crossing them will cost us things we cannot fully anticipate. And we are going to go anyway, not out of recklessness, not out of denial about the costs, but out of a considered, clear-eyed judgment that the project of spreading conscious, curious life across the cosmos is worth what it demands. There is something in that answer that resonates deeply with the history of our species, not because expansion has always been good. The history of human expansion across the Earth's surface is full of violence, exploitation, and destruction that no honest accounting can minimize. That history is real, and the lessons of it need to be carried into every conversation about interstellar expansion, because the patterns of behavior that produced colonial catastrophe on Earth will not automatically dissolve just because the destination is a different star system. But beneath and alongside that history, sometimes entangled with it in ways that are uncomfortable, sometimes clearly separable from it, is another pattern. The pattern of people going toward the unknown because the unknown called to them. The first anatomically modern humans who crossed the land bridge from Asia to the Americas tens of thousands of years ago. The Polynesian navigators who crossed the Pacific in outrigger canoes using stars and ocean swells and the flight patterns of birds as their instruments. The Arab and Chinese astronomers who mapped the sky centuries before European science caught up with them. Every scientist who has ever pointed an instrument at something no instrument had ever been pointed at before and waited to see what came back. That pattern is also real. It is also part of what we are. And the generation ship is its direct descendant. Here is what the science tells us, assembled from everything we have covered across these 9 previous parts. It tells us that the universe is full of stars, and that most stars have planets, and that some of those planets sit within conditions that could support liquid water and complex chemistry and possibly life. It tells us that life on Earth is extraordinarily robust, that it survives in conditions of temperature, pressure, radiation, and chemical hostility that challenge our intuitions about what biology requires, and that it has been doing so for at least 3.7 billion years without interruption. It tells us that the chemistry of life's building blocks, amino acids, nucleobases, organic molecules form spontaneously in space, in the cold interstellar medium, on the surfaces of asteroids and comets, suggesting that the universe has a deep tendency toward the kind of chemistry that produces living systems wherever conditions permit. It tells us that the obstacles to interstellar travel, radiation, confinement, genetic drift, resource limitation, psychological stress, cultural erosion are serious and real, but that none of them are fundamentally beyond the reach of science and technology and careful social design, given sufficient time and commitment. And it tells us, most quietly, most carefully, most tentatively, but unmistakably, that we are probably not the first complex, curious, technologically capable species to have looked at the stars and wondered about crossing the distances between them. The universe is simply too old and too large and too full of the ingredients for life for that to be the most likely explanation for the world we observe. We may be rare. We may even be unique in our particular galaxy at this particular moment in cosmic time, but the universe has had billions of years to run this experiment across hundreds of billions of galaxies, and the prior probability that we are its first and only successful instance of the kind of thing we are is, by any reasonable assessment, very small. Somewhere, somewhen, something else has looked up at the sky and felt the pull. Something else has asked the question. Something else has built the vessel, or will build it, or built it 1 billion years ago and sent it towards stars that we might someday find evidence of. We don't know. We genuinely, honestly, presently don't know. And that not knowing is not a failure of science. It is the current frontier of the most important question science has ever been asked to investigate. So what does this mean for you today? Watching this video from wherever you are, from the comfortable improbability of your particular life, on this particular planet, at this particular moment in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth. It means something specific, not vague inspiration, not abstract encouragement to dream big, something specific. It means that the civilization that will one day build a generation ship, and the scientific evidence suggests that civilization will exist, whether it is us or our descendants or something we become, will build it out of the culture and values and scientific understanding that exists when the moment is right. And that culture and those values and that scientific understanding are being shaped right now by what we choose to fund and what we choose to ignore, by what we teach our children and what we let them forget, by whether we take the long view or the short one, by whether we treat the practice of honest, careful scientific inquiry as a fundamental social value or as a luxury to be trimmed when times are hard. The people who will live on the generation ship, 40 generations of them, born into the longest and most demanding human project ever undertaken, will be the inheritors of whatever we build and whatever we break in the decades and centuries between now and then. Their capacity to survive the voyage, to sustain a good society inside a metal vessel across 1,000 years of isolation, to arrive at their destination as something worth preserving, that capacity will be shaped by us, by what we leave them. This is not a comfortable thought. It carries a weight of responsibility that is easy to deflect. It's so far in the future. It's so contingent on so many other things. It's so far beyond the scope of any individual life or any single generation's choices, but the weight is real. And the generation ship makes it visible in a way that almost nothing else does, because the consequences of what we build and what we break are playing out in this particular story, not somewhere else, but in the bodies and minds and societies of our own distant descendants. There is a concept in ecology called the shifting baseline syndrome. It was described by marine biologist Daniel Pauly in 1995, and it refers to the way each generation of scientists, and more broadly, each generation of human beings, calibrates its sense of normal based on the conditions it personally observed, rather than on the historical baseline that predates living memory. Each generation grows up in a world that is already changed from the one before. The forests are already smaller, the fisheries are already depleted, the coral reefs are already bleached relative to what they were. But because those are the conditions of childhood, they become the benchmark against which further change is measured. And the loss that occurred before living memory simply disappears from the accounting. The generation ship runs this process in reverse, and in doing so reveals something important. The people of the 400th year won't remember Earth. They won't remember what it felt like to walk on a planet, to breathe unmanaged air, to see an unmediated horizon, to feel rain. Those things will exist in their cultural record, in stories and images and music and ritual, but they will not exist in living memory. And the gap between cultural record and lived experience is, as we explored in Part 5, very large and very consequential. What they will have is what their civilization transmits to them. And what a civilization transmits across generations is not just information, it is values, it is the emotional weight attached to certain ideas. It is the sense of what matters and why. It is, in the deepest sense, the answer to the question of what the project is for. If the generation ship transmits reliably across 40 generations, through all the social turbulence and cultural evolution and institutional drift we have discussed, the genuine sense that the voyage is worth it, that the destination is real, that the sacrifice has meaning, that the universe on the other side of the crossing is worth crossing to find, that the practice of honest inquiry and careful reasoning and genuine curiosity is the most valuable thing any human community can preserve, then it will arrive not just at the destination, at something more important than the destination. It will arrive as the kind of thing that deserves to be there. This is the brutal reality of living on a generation ship for 1,000 years. Not just the radiation, not just the confinement, not just the genetic drift and the governance failures and the erosion of institutional memory. Those are real and serious, and the science behind each of them is exactly as challenging as we have described. The brutal reality is that it will require human beings to be, across 1,000 years and 40 generations, something that human beings have only ever managed to be for brief periods in specific places under favorable conditions. It will require them to be wise, consistently, institutionally, generationally wise, to build structures that outlast the wisdom of any individual and that correct for the inevitable failures of judgment and courage and honesty that every human generation produces, to hold the long view when the short view is more comfortable, to treat people as ends in themselves when treating them as means would be more efficient, to keep the practice of honest inquiry alive when settled certainty is more soothing, to remember what the journey is for when the journey is all anyone has ever known. This is hard. It is possibly the hardest thing our species has ever been asked to do, harder than the engineering, harder than the biology, harder than any of the technical challenges that the literature on generation ships has been working through for decades, and yet we have been here before. Not at this scale, not with these stakes, not across these distances. But the shape of the challenge is familiar. Every generation of human beings has faced some version of the question of whether they can build something worth living in and worth handing on. Most have failed in some ways, some have succeeded in others. The record is mixed and complicated and honest and human, but here we are. 4 billion years after the first self-replicating molecule formed in some warm, shallow pool on a young planet orbiting an unremarkable star in an outer spiral arm of a middling galaxy. Here we are, talking about the stars, asking whether we can reach them, understanding with a clarity that no previous generation of our species has possessed exactly what it would take. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, extraordinary. The generation ship is not just a spacecraft. It is a mirror. It shows us what we are, in all our complexity and difficulty and brilliance and fragility, by showing us what it would take to carry what we are across the void between stars and have it survive the crossing. And what it shows us, if we look honestly, is both more challenging and more hopeful than the engineering specifications suggest. It shows us a species that has been asking the same question since the first clear night of the first human consciousness. A species whose defining characteristic is not intelligence, exactly, or tool use, or language, but the specific relationship between all of those things and the unknown. The refusal to stop at the edge of what is known and familiar. The insistence on going further, looking closer, asking harder, even, especially, when the asking is uncomfortable and the answers are uncertain and the journey is long. It shows us a species that is, genuinely and in the most scientific sense available, made of the universe trying to understand itself, and it asks us, quietly, from the distance of stars we will probably never visit in our lifetimes, whether we are willing to do the work. Not the engineering work, though that matters, the human work. The work of building a civilization that is worth the distance it wants to travel. That is worth what the cosmos seems to be offering, in the form of a universe full of worlds and the capacity to wonder about them, The stars are not waiting for us. They do not know we exist. They will burn for billions of years regardless of what we do or don't do in the brief window of time available to us, but we know they exist. We know where they are. We know with increasing precision what circles them and what those worlds are made of, and whether the chemistry of life might exist on their surfaces, and we know what we would have to become to reach them. The question the universe is asking, the question that every part of this video has been circling, is simple. Are we willing to become it? Thank you for staying with this story all the way to its end. The science here is real. The genetics, the radiation biology, the psychology of confinement, the ecology of closed systems, the astrophysics of exoplanet characterization, all of it drawn from real research by real scientists who are genuinely working on these questions. The challenges are exactly as serious as described. The possibilities are exactly as extraordinary. If this video made you feel something, if it left you with the double sensation of smallness and significance that a clear night sky produces in certain people under certain conditions, then it did what it was designed to do. Not to answer the question of whether we should build a generation ship. That decision belongs to generations not yet born, and the wisdom to make it well is something we are still, as a species, in the process of developing. But to make the question feel real, to make the universe feel real, to remind you, because it is true and the science supports it, that you are not separate from this story. You are made of the same atoms that formed in the cores of stars that died before our sun was born. You are the product of 4 billion years of evolution that produced, against all probability, something that can look up at the sky and feel wonder about what it sees. You are a part of the universe that has become capable of asking where it came from and where it might go. The generation ship is a long way off, but the impulse that will one day build it, the curiosity, the courage, the willingness to ask hard questions and sit honestly with uncertain answers, that exists right now, in you. In this conversation between science and imagination that happens every time a human being looks up and wonders, that is where every journey begins. Look up. And speaking of journeys to other stars, there is a video on your screen right now about the horrifying reality of actually traveling to Proxima Centauri. Everything we just talked about, that video makes it personal. Click it, you will not regret it.